Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Gary Hutchinson had been driving cross-country freight for 19 years, and in all that time, he'd maintained one unbreakable rule: never pick up hitchhikers. The highways were full of desperate people with stories he didn't want to hear, problems he couldn't solve, and histories that could put an honest driver in serious danger. Gary had seen enough news reports about truckers who'd made the mistake of offering help to strangers, only to end up robbed, assaulted, or worse. His 2016 Peterbilt 389 was his livelihood, his home, and his sanctuary. No amount of guilt or sympathy was worth compromising that security. The rule had served him well throughout his career. He'd built a reputation among freight brokers as one of the most reliable drivers in the industry. Someone who could be counted on to deliver loads on time, every time, without the complications that seemed to plague other drivers. Gary's success wasn't just about his mechanical knowledge or his ability to navigate America's complex highway system. It was about his discipline, his unwillingness to let emotions override practical considerations, and his understanding that the trucking business was exactly that: a business, not a charity. Gary had learned this lesson the hard way early in his career. During his third year of driving, he'd picked up a hitchhiker outside of Bakersfield, California, a young man who claimed his car had broken down and he needed to get to Phoenix for a job interview. The man had seemed harmless enough, well-dressed and articulate, with a story that tugged at Gary's sympathetic nature. But halfway through Arizona, the hitchhiker had pulled a knife and demanded Gary's wallet, his CB radio, and anything else of value in the truck. Gary had managed to overpower the man and turn him over to the police at the next truck stop, but the experience had shaken him profoundly. He realized that his truck, which he'd always thought of as a fortress on wheels, was actually quite vulnerable when he allowed strangers inside. The incident had cost him nearly 2 days of lost driving time, extensive paperwork with law enforcement, and a cargo delivery that arrived late enough to damage his relationship with an important client. From that day forward, Gary had maintained his policy of never stopping for hitchhikers, no matter how desperate they appeared or how harsh the conditions might be. He'd driven past stranded motorists in blizzards, people standing beside smoking cars in desert heat, and even what appeared to be injured accident victims. Each time, he'd radioed the location to authorities and continued on his route, hardening his heart against the guilt that came with refusing to help people in obvious distress. But on the night of September 14th, 2024, somewhere along the desolate stretch of Interstate 40 through the New Mexico desert, Gary would break that rule in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The evening had started routinely enough. Gary was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Atlanta, running ahead of schedule as he always preferred. He'd departed Arizona at 6:00 p.m., timing his departure to cross the worst of the desert during the cooler nighttime hours. His trailer was loaded with 43,000 pounds of computer equipment destined for a major retailer's distribution center in Georgia. The cargo consisted of high-end servers, networking equipment, and point-of-sale systems worth nearly $2 million, valuable enough to require additional security measures and precise climate control throughout the journey. Gary had been running this particular route for almost 8 years, ever since his regular customer had expanded their operations into the Southwest. It was a good account that paid well and offered regular runs, but it also came with strict requirements for delivery timing and cargo security. The electronics had to be maintained within specific temperature and humidity ranges. The trailer had to be sealed and monitored throughout the journey, and any delays or deviations from the planned route had to be reported immediately to both the shipper and the consignee. The route from Phoenix to Atlanta covered approximately 1,100 miles and normally took Gary about 18 hours of driving time, spread over 2 days with mandatory rest periods. He preferred to handle the desert crossing during the first night, when temperatures were cooler and traffic was lighter, then catch his sleep break in Texas before tackling the congested highways of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama during daylight hours. Gary's truck was equipped with the latest navigation and communication technology, including GPS tracking that allowed his dispatcher to monitor his location in real time, electronic logging devices that recorded his hours of service automatically, and satellite communication systems that kept him connected even in the most remote areas of the country. The trailer itself had additional monitoring equipment that tracked temperature, humidity, and door status, sending alerts if any parameter moved outside acceptable ranges. As Gary crossed the Arizona-New Mexico border, everything was proceeding according to plan. The weather was clear with good visibility. His fuel consumption was tracking exactly where it should be for optimal efficiency, and his electronic logs showed that he was running about 30 minutes ahead of his planned schedule. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast emptiness broken only by the occasional exit sign or abandoned gas station. It was territory that Gary knew intimately, having crossed it hundreds of times over the course of his career. The New Mexico portion of Interstate 40 was particularly desolate, especially during the overnight hours when most of the tourist traffic had found places to stop for the night. The highway stretched for mile after mile through terrain that looked essentially identical: rolling hills covered with sparse desert vegetation, distant mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and the occasional cluster of lights marking some tiny settlement that existed primarily to serve travelers passing through on the interstate. Gary had always found something both beautiful and slightly unnerving about the desert at night. The vastness of the landscape made him feel simultaneously free and isolated, aware that he was just a tiny speck of humanity moving through an environment that remained fundamentally hostile to human life. During the day, the desert was harsh and unforgiving, with temperatures that could kill an unprepared traveler within hours. At night, it became a different kind of dangerous, cold enough to be deadly, dark enough to hide any number of hazards, and empty enough that help might be hundreds of miles away if something went wrong. It was this awareness of the desert's dangers that made Gary's decision to stop for a hitchhiker so completely out of character. He'd driven past stranded travelers in this exact area dozens of times over the years, always maintaining his policy of reporting their location to authorities, but never stopping to offer direct assistance. The desert was simply too dangerous a place to take risks with unknown passengers, and Gary had always been comfortable with his decision to prioritize his own safety over the immediate needs of strangers. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Gary's headlights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway about a quarter mile ahead. Even from that distance, he could see the unmistakable posture of someone seeking a ride, thumb extended, small duffel bag at their feet, the desperate stance of a person stranded in one of the most unforgiving environments in North America. Gary's speedometer showed 68 miles per hour, slightly above the posted speed limit, but well within the range that enforcement officers typically allowed for commercial vehicles. Gary's first instinct was to maintain his speed and drive past without stopping, just as he had done countless times before. His hands remained steady on the steering wheel, his foot maintained constant pressure on the accelerator, and his eyes focused on the road ahead rather than the figure on the shoulder. This was the routine he'd followed for 16 years since the incident in Arizona, and it had kept him safe and profitable throughout his career. But something about this particular hitchhiker made him begin to slow down as he approached. Maybe it was the location. They were at least 60 miles from the nearest town in any direction, farther from civilization than any reasonable person should attempt to walk. Maybe it was the time of night, nearly midnight, when desert temperatures could drop to potentially lethal levels for someone without proper shelter. Maybe it was the figure's apparent composure. Instead of frantic waving or obvious distress, The hitchhiker stood calmly beside the highway with a patience that suggested either confidence that help would arrive or resignation to whatever fate awaited them in the desert darkness. As he drew closer, Gary could see that the hitchhiker was indeed a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing jeans and a light jacket that seemed woefully inadequate for the desert night. She had long dark hair that caught the wind, and even in the harsh glare of his headlights, there was something striking about her appearance. Her posture was straight and confident, without the slumped shoulders or desperate body language that Gary associated with people in genuine distress. She wasn't frantically waving or showing signs of panic. Instead, she stood calmly beside the highway, thumb extended with a confidence that suggested she knew someone would eventually stop. Gary found himself pressing the brake pedal, his truck's air brakes responding with the familiar hiss that accompanied any significant reduction in speed. His rational mind was screaming at him to maintain his course and drive past the woman, just as he'd done with hundreds of other stranded travelers over the years. But something deeper than rational thought was compelling him to stop, a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and perhaps a growing sense that this encounter was somehow different from all the others. Gary pulled his truck to the shoulder about 50 yards past the woman, his hazard lights automatically activating as he brought the massive vehicle to a complete stop. The air brakes released with another hiss, and the engine settled into the steady idle that indicated the truck was ready to resume movement at a moment's notice. Gary sat behind the wheel for a long moment, watching in his mirrors as the woman began walking toward his cab, still moving with that same confident stride that had caught his attention from the beginning. As she approached, Gary could see more details about her appearance. She appeared to be in good physical condition, not showing obvious signs of dehydration or exhaustion that would be expected from someone who'd been stranded in the desert for any significant period. Her clothing, while casual, seemed clean and relatively unwrinkled, without the dust and grime that the desert environment typically deposited on everything exposed to its elements. Most puzzling of all, she carried herself with an air of calm assurance that seemed completely at odds with her apparent situation. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said as Gary rolled down his passenger window. Her voice was clear and pleasant, with just a hint of an accent that he couldn't quite place. It sounded vaguely European, but with American inflections that suggested someone who'd been living in the United States for many years. "I was beginning to think I'd be out here all night." "What happened to your car?" Gary asked, scanning the highway behind her for any sign of a broken-down vehicle. The road stretched empty in both directions, with no signs of disabled vehicles, emergency flashers, or any other indication of automotive trouble. "It overheated about 5 miles back," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the east. "I left it at a rest area and started walking toward town, but I guess I misjudged the distance." Gary looked in the direction she'd indicated, but he couldn't remember passing any rest areas in the last 20 miles. The closest facility he could recall was the truck stop in Tucumcari, which was still more than 40 miles ahead. There were a few smaller facilities along this stretch of highway, scenic overlooks and historical markers that provided basic parking but no services, but nothing that could be described as a rest area where someone might reasonably leave a disabled vehicle. "Which rest area?" Gary asked, trying to pin down the location she was referring to. "Just a small roadside park," she said, her answer coming perhaps a little too quickly. "You probably didn't notice it. It's set back from the highway, easy to miss if you're not looking for it." Gary had been driving this route regularly for almost 8 years, and he prided himself on knowing every facility, every exit, and every landmark along the way. It was part of his professional expertise, the kind of detailed knowledge that allowed him to plan fuel stops, rest breaks, and route adjustments with precision. He was certain that there were no roadside parks or rest areas in the location the woman was describing, but he also recognized that the desert at night could be disorienting, and distances could be difficult to judge for someone unfamiliar with the terrain. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Amarillo," she said. I've got family there who can help me get my car fixed. Amarillo was directly on Gary's route, about 200 miles ahead through the heart of the Texas Panhandle. It wouldn't cost him any time to give her a ride, since he'd be passing through the city anyway as part of his planned route to Atlanta. In fact, dropping her off in Amarillo might even provide a good opportunity for a fuel stop and a quick inspection of his cargo, both of which were part of his normal routine for this run. "All right," Gary said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. "Climb on up. But I need to warn you, I don't make any stops between here and Amarillo except for fuel." "That's perfectly fine," she said, climbing into the cab with surprising agility for someone who'd supposedly been walking in the desert. "I really appreciate this. My name's Linda, by the way." "Gary," he replied, checking his mirrors before pulling back onto the highway. "Been driving this route for almost 20 years, and I've never seen anyone stranded out here before. You're lucky I came along when I did." Linda settled into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt with the practiced motion of someone accustomed to riding in commercial vehicles. Gary noticed that she seemed immediately comfortable in the truck's cab, adjusting the seat position and air vents as if she'd ridden in similar vehicles many times before. Her familiarity with the truck's interior was another small detail that didn't quite match her story of being a stranded motorist, but Gary filed it away without comment. "I know," Linda said, as Gary accelerated back to highway speed. "I was starting to worry that I'd made a serious mistake trying to walk for help. The desert at night is different than I expected." As they settled into the rhythm of highway driving, Gary found himself glancing at his passenger more frequently than he probably should have. There was something unusual about Linda that he couldn't quite identify, something that went beyond her composed demeanor and clean appearance. Her skin seemed unusually pale in the dashboard lights, almost luminescent, as if it was reflecting more light than it should have been able to absorb. Her clothes, while wrinkled from travel, showed no signs of the dust and grime that would be expected from someone who'd been walking along a desert highway. Most strange of all, the cab's temperature seemed to have dropped noticeably since she'd climbed aboard, despite the fact that Gary's heating system was functioning normally. The digital readout on his climate control system showed the same temperature setting he'd been using all evening, but the actual air temperature felt significantly cooler, almost uncomfortably so. Gary found himself reaching for the temperature control to increase the heat, but Linda showed no signs of being affected by the cold. "So, what brings you out to New Mexico?" Gary asked, trying to make conversation and distract himself from the growing sense of unease that had been building since Linda entered his truck. "I was visiting a friend in Phoenix," Linda replied without hesitation. "Just a short trip, but my car started acting up on the way back home. I probably should have had it checked before making the drive, but you know how it is. You think everything will be fine until it isn't." Gary nodded, understanding the sentiment. He'd learned the hard way that mechanical problems always seemed to happen at the worst possible times, usually when you were farthest from help and least prepared to deal with them. "What kind of car are you driving?" There was a slight pause before Linda answered, just long enough to be noticeable. "A Honda Civic. Blue. Nothing fancy, but it's been reliable until now." Gary filed that information away, though something about her response felt rehearsed. The pause before answering, the generic description, the way she'd provided exactly the kind of details someone might give if they were making up a story on the spot. But then again, people often hesitated when talking to strangers, especially when they were in vulnerable situations that required them to depend on the kindness of others. Over the next hour, Gary tried several times to engage Linda in conversation, asking about her family in Amarillo, her work, her life in general. Her answers were polite but evasive, never providing specific details that would make her story feel authentic or personal. She claimed to work in customer service but couldn't name her employer when Gary asked about the company. She said she had a sister in Amarillo but couldn't remember the exact address when he offered to drop her off at a specific location. When Gary asked about local restaurants or landmarks in the city, Linda's responses were so generic they could have applied to any mid-sized American town. "Have you lived in Amarillo long?" Gary asked during one of these conversations. "Most of my life," Linda replied. "It's a nice place, quiet, good for raising a family." "Do you have kids?" Another pause. "No, not yet. Maybe someday." Gary found these conversational gaps increasingly troubling. Linda seemed intelligent and articulate, but her answers to personal questions had a vague, almost scripted quality that suggested she was working from a prepared story rather than drawing on actual memories and experiences. It was the kind of conversation pattern that Gary associated with people who were hiding something significant about their background or circumstances. What bothered Gary most was the way Linda seemed to know things about his route that she shouldn't have known. She mentioned truck stops and mile markers that lay ahead, casually referencing landmarks and exit numbers as if she'd traveled this highway many times before. When they passed a historical marker that commemorated some forgotten battle from the 19th century, Linda commented on the monument as if she'd seen it before. When Gary's CB radio crackled with a traffic report about construction delays near the Texas border, Linda nodded knowingly and mentioned that the roadwork had been going on for months. "You seem pretty familiar with this highway," Gary observed after Linda had correctly predicted the location of an upcoming way station. "I've driven it several times to visit my friend in Phoenix," Linda replied, but her answer didn't match the timeline she'd established earlier. If this was only her second or third trip to Phoenix, she shouldn't have had such detailed knowledge of highway markers and facilities that were primarily of interest to professional drivers who traveled the route regularly. The inconsistencies in Linda's story began to accumulate, creating a growing sense of doubt in Gary's mind. He started paying closer attention to his passenger, noting details that had escaped his initial observation. Linda's clothes, while appropriate for travel, had an oddly timeless quality. Jeans and a jacket that could have been from any decade in the past 30 years. The style wasn't obviously dated, but it also wasn't clearly contemporary, as if she'd chosen clothing that would blend in regardless of when she was seen. Her hair, which had appeared windblown when he'd first seen her on the highway, remained perfectly styled despite the fact that she'd supposedly been walking in the desert wind for several hours. The desert was notorious for its unpredictable air currents, especially at night when temperature differentials created constantly shifting breezes that could make it impossible to maintain any kind of neat appearance. Yet Linda's hair looked as if she'd just stepped out of a salon, every strand in place despite her supposed ordeal. Most unsettling of all, Gary began to notice that Linda's breathing seemed irregular, sometimes barely perceptible, as if she were holding her breath for extended periods. Normal human breathing was automatic and constant, but Linda's chest rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost voluntary, as if she had to remember to breathe rather than doing so naturally. When Gary concentrated on listening for her breathing, there were long periods when he couldn't detect any sound at all, followed by sudden, conscious-seeming inhalations that suggested she'd just remembered the need for air. Around 1:30 a.m., as they approached the Texas border, Gary decided to test his growing suspicions by asking Linda a direct question about her situation. "You said your car overheated at a rest area 5 miles back from where I picked you up. Which rest area was that? I don't remember passing any facilities recently." Linda's response was immediate and confident, without the hesitation that might be expected from someone trying to remember details of a stressful situation. "It was just a small roadside park, not a major rest stop. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. They have picnic tables and a historical marker about some old trading post." Gary knew for certain that there were no roadside parks or rest areas in the stretch of highway they'd just covered. He'd been driving this route regularly for almost 8 years, and he was familiar with every facility, every exit, and every landmark along the way. His knowledge wasn't just casual familiarity. It was professional expertise that he'd developed through years of careful observation and route planning. Linda was either seriously confused about her location, or she was deliberately lying about the circumstances that had led to their meeting. "Tell me about your car again," Gary said, trying to keep his voice casual and conversational. "You said it was a blue Honda Civic?" "That's right," Linda replied without hesitation. "What year?" This time there was a noticeable pause, longer than the brief hesitations that had marked her earlier responses. 2018, she said finally. Gary was certain he'd asked her the same question earlier in their conversation, and he distinctly remembered her giving a different answer. He thought she'd said 2015, but he couldn't be completely sure since he hadn't been paying as much attention to inconsistencies at the beginning of their journey. Now, however, he was actively looking for discrepancies in her story, and this direct contradiction was exactly the kind of evidence he needed to confirm his growing suspicions. "And it just overheated? No other problems?" "The temperature gauge started climbing just after I passed through Santa Rosa," Linda said, referring to a town they'd passed more than an hour earlier. "I thought I could make it to the next service station, but the engine started making noise, so I pulled off at the rest area to let it cool down." Gary knew the area around Santa Rosa well, and he was certain there were no rest areas between that town and the location where he'd picked up Linda. There were truck stops, gas stations, and fast food restaurants along the main commercial strip, but no facilities that matched Linda's description of a small roadside park with picnic tables and historical markers. She was describing a place that simply didn't exist, at least not along the route they'd been traveling. Gary was now certain that Linda was not who she claimed to be, but he wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge. They were still in the middle of the desert, more than 100 miles from the nearest city of any significant size. Even if Linda was lying about her identity and circumstances, she was still a person who needed transportation to civilization. Abandoning her on the roadside would be both illegal and immoral, regardless of whatever deception she might be engaged in. But as the miles passed and they crossed into Texas, Gary began to notice other disturbing details about his passenger that went beyond simple inconsistencies in her story. When he glanced in his rearview mirror, Linda's reflection seemed oddly distorted, as if the mirror was showing a slightly different version of the woman sitting beside him. In the reflection, her hair appeared shorter and darker, her clothes seemed to be different colors, and her facial features were subtly altered in ways that were difficult to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. Gary blinked hard and looked again, focusing intently on the mirror image, but the discrepancy persisted. The woman reflected in his rearview mirror was similar to Linda, but clearly not identical, as if he was seeing two different people occupying the same space. When he turned to look directly at Linda, she appeared exactly as she had throughout their journey: dark hair, pale skin, jeans, and jacket. But when he looked back at the mirror, the reflection showed someone else entirely. Even more troubling was the way Linda seemed to react to things before they happened. When Gary's CB radio crackled with a transmission from another driver, Linda would turn toward the radio a split second before the sound began, as if she could hear the incoming signal before it became audible. When Gary reached for his coffee cup, Linda would shift in her seat as if anticipating the movement before he'd made any conscious decision to reach for the drink. When oncoming traffic appeared in the distance, Linda would glance toward the approaching headlights before they were bright enough to attract attention. It was as if she could see a few seconds into the future, or as if she was somehow connected to Gary's thoughts and intentions in a way that allowed her to predict his actions before he performed them. The phenomenon was subtle enough that it might have been coincidence, but it happened consistently enough that Gary became convinced it was something more than chance. The temperature in the cab continued to drop despite Gary's repeated attempts to adjust the heating system. His breath began to form small clouds in the air, and he could see frost forming on the inside of the windows near Linda's seat. The digital readout on his climate control system continued to show normal operating temperatures, but the actual conditions in the cab were approaching freezing levels. Gary found himself shivering and pulling his jacket tighter, but Linda sat comfortably in her light clothing, apparently unaware of the Arctic conditions that were developing around them. "Are you cold at all?" Gary asked, hoping to get some explanation for the inexplicable temperature drop. "Not particularly," Linda replied. "I tend to run warm. The cool air feels good to me." Gary looked at his passenger more carefully and realized that she showed no physical signs of being affected by the cold. Her skin wasn't flushed or pale in the way that would indicate a response to low temperatures. Her posture remained relaxed and comfortable, without the hunched shoulders or protective positioning that people typically adopted when they were cold. Most telling of all, she wasn't breathing in the visible puffs of vapor that the cold air was producing from Gary's own respiration. At 2:15 a.m., as they approached the outskirts of Amarillo, Gary's fuel gauge indicated that he would need to stop for diesel soon. There was a truck stop in Tucumcari, about 20 miles ahead, where he typically refueled on this route. The facility was well maintained, reasonably priced, and strategically located to allow him to complete the remainder of his journey to Atlanta without another fuel stop. He mentioned this to Linda, expecting her to express gratitude for the opportunity to warm up, use restroom facilities, or call her family to arrange pickup. Instead, Linda's reaction was immediate and intense, more emotional than anything she'd displayed during their entire conversation. "No," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been there before. "Please, don't stop there. Can't you make it to the next fuel stop?" Gary checked his fuel gauge again, running quick calculations in his head based on his current consumption rate and the distance remaining to various refueling options. He had enough diesel to reach Amarillo, but stopping in Tucumcari was part of his normal routine, and he'd already logged the planned stop with his dispatcher as part of his electronic reporting requirements. Deviating from his planned route without justification could raise questions with his employer and potentially affect his performance ratings. "I always stop in Tucumcari," Gary said. "It's the cheapest fuel on this route, and I know the facility well. The timing works perfectly with my schedule. Why don't you want to stop there?" Linda's composure, which had been perfect for the past 3 hours, began to crack in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, began to fidget with the fabric of her jacket. Her breathing, already irregular, became more obviously labored. Most significantly, her voice took on a quality that hadn't been there before, a slight tremor that suggested she was struggling to maintain her calm facade. I'd prefer not to stop there," she said. "Bad memories, you know? Could we please just continue to Amarillo? I'll pay for the extra fuel if that's what you're worried about." Gary studied his passenger's face in the dashboard lights and saw something that made his blood run cold. For just a moment, as Linda spoke about her reluctance to stop in Tucumcari, her features seemed to shift and blur, as if her face was a projection that had temporarily lost focus. Her eyes, which had appeared brown throughout their journey, now seemed to be a different color entirely, perhaps blue or gray, or something that wasn't quite either. Her skin, already pale, took on an almost translucent quality that made it possible to see what looked like dark veins beneath the surface. When Gary blinked and looked again, Linda appeared normal, but the brief glimpse of whatever she really was had been enough to send adrenaline coursing through his system. His hands tightened involuntarily on the steering wheel, and he found himself pressing slightly harder on the accelerator, as if increasing their speed would somehow provide protection from whatever was sitting in his passenger seat. "Linda," Gary said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to overwhelm his rational thought processes. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. What are you?" The question hung in the air between them for a long moment, filled with implications that neither of them wanted to acknowledge directly. Linda stared straight ahead through the windshield, her profile illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed in ways that were impossible to mistake for normal human variation. It was still feminine, but now it carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources, as if several people were speaking in perfect unison. The sound had an otherworldly quality that made Gary's skin crawl and his heart rate increase to levels that bordered on panic. When Linda turned to look at him, her eyes held depths that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been physically possible within the confines of a human skull. "I'm someone who needs help getting home," she said, her multi-layered voice carrying undertones that seemed to resonate in Gary's chest cavity. "Just like I told you. But you're not really Linda, are you?" Another pause, longer this time, as if the entity in his passenger seat was considering how much truth to reveal. "Names are just labels, Gary. They don't change what a person really is, or what they need to survive." Gary felt his hands begin to shake on the steering wheel. "What do you want from me?" "Just what I said. A ride to Amarillo. Nothing more, nothing less. And if I decide to stop in Tucumcari anyway?" Linda turned to look at him directly for the first time since entering the truck. Her eyes, which had been relatively normal human eyes just moments before, now seemed to contain depths that extended for miles into some unimaginable darkness. Gary felt as if he was looking into a tunnel that stretched beyond the boundaries of physical space, and somewhere in that darkness, things were moving, things that he didn't want to see clearly but couldn't help but perceive at the edges of his consciousness. "You won't stop in Tucumcari," Linda said with absolute certainty, her voice now clearly coming from multiple sources that somehow maintained perfect synchronization. "You'll drive straight through to Amarillo, just like I asked. You'll do it because you're a good person, Gary, and good people help those who need assistance." Gary tried to argue, tried to assert his independence and his right to make his own decisions about his route and his stops. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell Linda that he was the driver and he would decide where and when to stop. But when he attempted to form words, no sound came out. His vocal cords refused to respond to his conscious commands, as if the connection between his brain and his voice had been severed by some invisible force. He tried again, concentrating all his willpower on the simple act of speaking, but the result was the same. Linda had somehow taken control of his ability to communicate, leaving him unable to protest or call for help even as his truck continued moving toward whatever destination she had in mind. But the loss of his voice was only the beginning. Gary found that his foot was pressing harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck past the Tucumcari exit without even slowing down. His hands turned the steering wheel to keep the truck centered in the lane, but he wasn't consciously directing their movement. Linda had taken control of his truck, his route, and his body, leaving Gary as a passenger in his own cab, watching helplessly as his vehicle carried him toward a destination he was no longer certain he wanted to reach. "Don't be afraid," Linda said, her voice returning to something closer to its original pleasant tone, though the underlying harmonics remained. "I'm not going to hurt you, Gary. I just need to get home, and you're helping me do that. In a way, you're performing a public service." Gary tried desperately to understand what she meant by that, but his voice still wouldn't work, leaving him unable to ask questions or demand explanations. He could think, he could feel, and he could observe everything that was happening around him, but he could no longer control his own actions or speak his own words. It was a form of imprisonment that was more terrifying than any physical restraint could have been. As they drove through the night toward Amarillo, Linda began to tell Gary the truth about who she was and why she needed his help. Her real name wasn't Linda, and she wasn't a stranded motorist seeking assistance from a helpful trucker. She was something much older and more dangerous, an entity that had been using America's highway system to move between locations for decades, perhaps centuries. "You humans build such wonderful transportation networks," she said, her voice taking on an almost affectionate tone. "Roads that connect every corner of your continent, allowing creatures like me to travel vast distances without being detected. Your highways are perfect hunting grounds, Gary. Long stretches of emptiness where a traveler can disappear without anyone noticing for days or weeks." Gary felt his blood turn to ice as he began to understand the implications of what Linda was telling him. She wasn't just using the highways for transportation, she was using them to find victims, people who would stop to help a stranger in apparent distress, only to discover too late that they were dealing with something that wasn't entirely human. "I feed on life force," Linda continued, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. "The energy that keeps your hearts beating, your minds thinking, your bodies functioning. It's different from physical nourishment, more essential, more fundamental, and it's something that can only be taken from living creatures who offer it willingly, or who can be convinced to share it through acts of kindness and compassion." As Linda spoke, Gary began to feel the truth of her words in his own body. His vision was becoming blurry, his thoughts were slowing down, and his physical strength seemed to be gradually draining away. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but rather a steady diminishment of his vital energy, as if Linda was slowly siphoning off the force that kept him alive and aware. "You should feel honored," Linda said. "Most drivers only last an hour or two before I've taken everything I need from them. But you're stronger than most, Gary. Your life force is particularly rich and nourishing. You've given me enough energy to sustain myself for weeks, maybe months." Gary tried to fight against the draining sensation, to somehow resist Linda's influence and reclaim control of his own body and truck, but his efforts were futile. The entity beside him had tapped into something fundamental about his existence, and she was drawing that essence out of him with the efficiency of a predator that had perfected its hunting techniques over many years. "The beauty of the highway system," Linda continued, "is that drivers disappear all the time for perfectly normal reasons. Mechanical failures, medical emergencies, accidents in remote areas where help doesn't arrive in time. When a truck is found abandoned on the roadside with no sign of the driver, authorities assume he wandered off seeking help and succumbed to the elements. They rarely look for supernatural explanations." Gary could feel his consciousness beginning to fade at the edges, his awareness becoming dim and distant as Linda continued to drain his life force. But even as his strength ebbed away, his mind remained clear enough to understand the full horror of his situation. He wasn't just dying. He was being consumed by something that had been preying on helpful drivers for decades, perhaps centuries, leaving a trail of unexplained disappearances across America's highway system. "I've been riding these roads since before your interstate system existed," Linda said, her voice now carrying an ancient quality that suggested she was far older than her apparent age. "Back when the highways were just dirt tracks connecting frontier settlements, I would appear to travelers in covered wagons, claiming to be a widow seeking passage to the next town. The method has evolved with the times, but the principle remains the same. Appeal to human compassion, gain access to isolated victims, and feed." As they approached the Amarillo city limits, Linda directed Gary to exit the interstate and drive toward the industrial district on the west side of town. The area was largely abandoned at night, with empty warehouses and shuttered factories providing perfect cover for whatever Linda had planned for the conclusion of their journey. Gary's truck responded to her mental commands, following a route through darkened streets that led away from the populated areas of the city and toward a zone of urban decay where screams wouldn't be heard and bodies might not be discovered for months. The buildings around them grew progressively more derelict as they moved deeper into the abandoned industrial area. Broken windows stared down at them like empty eye sockets, and weeds grew through cracks in the pavement where legitimate businesses had once thrived. It was the kind of place where people came to dispose of things they didn't want found. where the homeless sought shelter in structures that were slowly being reclaimed by nature, and where predators like Linda could operate without interference from law enforcement or witnesses. Gary's truck rolled to a stop in the parking lot of an abandoned trucking company, its engine finally shutting down as Linda released her control over the vehicle's systems. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through broken windows and the settling noises of cooling metal. Gary slumped in his driver's seat, barely conscious and unable to move more than his eyes, watching helplessly as Linda prepared to complete whatever ritual would finish the transfer of his life force into her supernatural form. Linda climbed down from the cab and walked around to the driver's side, moving with the fluid grace of a predator that was completely confident in its control over the situation. She opened Gary's door and looked up at him with what might have been sympathy, her face illuminated by the ambient light from the distant city. For a moment, she almost looked human again, a woman in her 30s, who might have been someone's daughter, sister, or friend under different circumstances. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice returning to the pleasant tone she'd used when she first entered his truck. "You were exactly what I needed tonight, Gary. Your kindness has sustained me, and your life force will keep me strong for the journeys ahead." Linda reached up and touched Gary's forehead with her fingertips, and the contact sent a final surge of energy from Gary's body into hers. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, not painful exactly, but profoundly draining, as if every memory, every emotion, every thought he'd ever had was being pulled out of him and absorbed by the creature that had been masquerading as a helpless hitchhiker. As Linda completed the energy transfer, Gary felt his consciousness fading toward complete darkness. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, his hearing became muffled and distant, and his awareness of his own body began to slip away like sand through his fingers. He was dying, but it wasn't the quick death of an accident or the prolonged struggle of disease. It was the gradual extinction of everything that made him who he was, leaving behind only an empty shell that would soon collapse from the absence of the vital force that had once animated it. But just before Gary lost consciousness entirely, he heard something that gave him a final moment of hope. Sirens approaching fast from multiple directions, police cars, ambulances, and what sounded like federal agents, all converging on their location with the urgency of a coordinated law enforcement operation. The sound grew louder by the second, suggesting a large force of vehicles racing through the abandoned industrial district toward the exact spot where Linda had brought Gary to die. Linda heard the sirens too, and for the first time since entering Gary's truck, she showed signs of genuine fear. Her composed facade cracked completely, revealing something beneath that was definitely not human. Her features began to shift and blur more dramatically than they had during the journey, as if the approaching law enforcement presence was interfering with her ability to maintain human form. "This isn't possible," she said, backing away from Gary's truck as the sirens grew louder. "No one knows about this place. No one could have tracked us here." The parking lot was suddenly filled with flashing lights as more than a dozen law enforcement vehicles surrounded the abandoned trucking facility. Federal agents in tactical gear poured out of unmarked SUVs, their weapons drawn and their movements coordinated with the precision of a unit that had been planning this operation for a long time. Local police and paramedics followed close behind, establishing a perimeter around the scene while medical personnel rushed toward Gary's truck. One of the federal agents, a woman in her 40s wearing an FBI windbreaker, approached Linda with her weapon drawn but not directly threatening. "Linda Morrison," she called out, using what was apparently the entity's most recent alias. "Or whatever your real name might be, you're under arrest for the murders of at least 37 truck drivers across 12 states. Linda's human disguise began to dissolve completely as she realized the hopelessness of her situation. Her features shifted and flowed like liquid, revealing glimpses of something underneath that was definitely not human. For brief moments, Gary caught sight of what she really was. something ancient and predatory that had been wearing human appearance like a mask, but which belonged to a completely different order of existence. "You can't hold me," Linda said, her voice now clearly coming from multiple sources as her control over human speech patterns began to fail. "I've been walking these roads since before your civilization existed. I'll escape from whatever prison you think you can build, and I'll return to feed on your highways until every truck driver in America learns to fear the sight of a stranded traveler." But even as Linda made her threats, the federal agents were deploying equipment that Gary had never seen before. Devices that hummed with electronic energy and cast strange geometric patterns of light that seemed to have a physical effect on the entity that had been calling herself Linda. Where the light touched her, her form became more solid and less able to shift between appearances, as if the technology was somehow forcing her to maintain a stable physical state. A second agent, a man with graying hair and the bearing of someone who'd been dealing with unusual cases for many years, began reading Linda her rights from a card that listed charges Gary had never heard of before. "You're being arrested under the Federal Supernatural Entities Control Act for the premeditated murder of interstate commerce drivers, violation of dimensional travel restrictions, and operating a feeding territory without proper federal oversight." As the agents took Linda into custody using restraints that appeared to be made of some kind of metal that glowed with its own internal light, paramedics reached Gary's truck and began checking his vital signs. "We're going to get you help," one of them told him, though Gary could barely hear the words through the fog that was settling over his consciousness. "You're going to be all right. You've lost a lot of life force, but our medical team knows how to treat this kind of energy drain." Gary tried to ask how they had found him, how they had known where to look, and what the Federal Supernatural Entities Control Act was, but his voice still wouldn't work. The paramedic seemed to understand his unspoken questions. "We've been tracking her for 3 years," she explained as her team prepared to transport Gary to what was apparently a specialized medical facility. "Linda Morrison, though that's just one of dozens of names she's used over the centuries. She's been using truck drivers to move around the country, leaving a trail of unexplained fatalities and disappearances that finally established a pattern we could recognize." As the paramedics loaded Gary onto a stretcher and prepared to transport him to the hospital, he caught a final glimpse of Linda being loaded into what looked like a specially modified prisoner transport vehicle. Even in custody, there was something about her that continued to seem wrong, as if her human appearance was just the surface of something much larger and more dangerous that existed mostly in dimensions that human senses couldn't perceive. The Supernatural Predator Task Force has been monitoring highway disappearances for over a decade. The paramedic continued as they loaded Gary into the ambulance. "When your truck's GPS signal showed you deviating from your planned route and heading toward this location, we knew she had found another victim. The tracking devices in your electronic logging system allowed us to coordinate this operation and arrive before she could complete the feeding process." Gary spent the next 3 weeks recovering in a federal medical facility that he learned was one of several institutions designed to treat victims of supernatural encounters. The hospital was staffed by doctors and nurses who understood energy drain, psychic trauma, and the various forms of damage that could be inflicted by entities that existed on the boundaries of human understanding. Gary's treatment involved not just physical rehabilitation, but also psychological counseling to help him process an experience that challenged everything he'd believed about the nature of reality. During his recovery, Gary was interviewed extensively by federal agents who explained that Linda Morrison was part of a larger investigation into supernatural phenomena that affected interstate commerce. The Federal Supernatural Entities Control Act was a classified law that had been passed in the 1960s after a series of unexplained incidents involving long-haul truckers, airline pilots, and other transportation workers who came into contact with entities that used America's travel infrastructure for their own purposes. "She's what we classify as a highway feeder," Agent Sarah Chen explained during one of their interviews. These entities have been using the American road system as hunting grounds for over a century, targeting isolated drivers who are vulnerable to appeals for help. They typically operate by assuming human appearance and presenting themselves as stranded travelers, accident victims, or other people in apparent distress. Agent Chen showed Gary files containing dozens of similar cases dating back to the early days of the interstate highway system. Truck drivers who had disappeared without explanation, vehicles found abandoned with no sign of their operators, and missing person reports that had never been solved because investigators were looking for human perpetrators rather than supernatural predators. Linda Morrison has been active since at least the 1940s, Chen continued. We have photographs of her from crime scenes dating back 7 decades, and she hasn't aged a day. She typically operates for a few years in one region, then disappears for a decade or more before surfacing somewhere else entirely. This is the first time we've managed to capture her alive. Gary learned that his experience was being used to develop new protocols for protecting commercial drivers from supernatural predators. The GPS tracking systems that had allowed the federal agents to locate him were being upgraded to detect unusual route deviations that might indicate driver compromise. Training programs were being developed to help truckers recognize the signs of supernatural encounters, and new communication systems were being installed to allow drivers to call for help when they encountered entities that were beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. When Gary was finally released from the hospital, he found that his truck had been returned to him, apparently undamaged by its encounter with Linda. But Gary knew that he would never be able to drive long-haul routes again. The experience had changed him in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, leaving him with an awareness of the dangers that lurked along America's highways that made it impossible for him to feel safe on the road. Gary sold his truck and used the money to buy a small auto repair shop in his hometown in Ohio. He never drove professionally again, and he never spoke publicly about his encounter with Linda Morrison. But the federal government provided him with a disability pension that recognized his service to interstate commerce protection, and he was occasionally consulted by investigators working on similar cases involving supernatural highway predators. Sometimes, late at night when Gary was working alone in his garage, he would hear the sound of 18-wheelers passing on the highway outside. The sound would remind him of Linda, and he would wonder if she had escaped from federal custody and returned to the endless miles where predators like her could hunt with virtual impunity. According to Agent Chen, the specialized facility where Linda was being held had never had a successful escape. But Gary had seen enough of Linda's capabilities to know that traditional security measures might not be sufficient to contain something that existed partially outside normal physical reality. The highway had taught Gary that not all passengers were human, and that sometimes the greatest danger came not from mechanical failure or bad weather, but from the willingness to help a stranger in need. He had learned that the roads carried more than just cargo and commerce. They carried entities that existed on the boundary between the physical world and something far more sinister. Creatures that had been using human transportation networks as hunting grounds since the first roads had been built. Gary's experience with Linda Morrison had shown him that America's highway system was more than just a transportation network. It was a complex ecosystem where human commerce intersected with supernatural predation, where federal agents worked in secret to protect drivers from threats that most people never suspected existed. The roads were a battleground in a war that most Americans didn't know was being fought, a conflict between human civilization and entities that viewed the interstate system as their personal feeding territory. But Gary also learned that there were people fighting back. Federal agents and researchers who understood the true nature of the highways and who worked tirelessly to protect commercial drivers from supernatural predators. The existence of the Federal Supernatural Entities Control Act and the specialized medical facilities that treated victims of entity encounters proved that the government was aware of these threats and was taking action to address them, even if the general public remained ignorant of the true dangers that traveled America's roads. In the months that followed his encounter with Linda, Gary received regular updates from Agent Chen about the investigation into highway feeders and similar supernatural threats to interstate commerce. He learned that Linda Morrison had been transferred to a maximum security facility designed specifically for supernatural prisoners, where she was being studied by researchers who hoped to understand how entities like her operated and how they might be more effectively detected and captured in the future. "She's providing information about other highway predators," Chen told Gary during one of their periodic phone calls. "Not voluntarily, but the psychological evaluation techniques we use on supernatural prisoners are quite effective. We've identified at least 6 other entities that operate similar feeding territories, and we're developing strategies for capturing them." Gary also learned that his case had become a model for training new agents in the Supernatural Crimes Division. His detailed recollection of Linda's behavior patterns, the subtle signs that had indicated she wasn't human, and the methods she had used to control his truck and drain his life force were all being incorporated into educational materials that would help future investigators recognize and respond to similar encounters. "Your experience has probably saved dozens of lives," Chen assured him. "The protocols we've developed based on your case are already being used to protect drivers across the highway system. The GPS monitoring enhancements, the emergency communication procedures, the training programs for recognizing supernatural encounters, all of that came from what you went through with Linda Morrison." But even knowing that his suffering had served a greater purpose, Gary never fully recovered from the psychological impact of his encounter with a creature that had come close to draining every bit of life force from his body. He suffered from chronic fatigue that doctors attributed to the energy drain he'd experienced, and he had persistent nightmares about dark highways populated by things that weren't entirely human. Gary's sleep was frequently disturbed by dreams in which he was driving through endless desert landscapes, picking up hitchhikers who initially appeared normal but gradually revealed themselves to be something else entirely. In these nightmares, he was trapped in his truck, unable to stop or change course, while entities wearing human faces drained his life force mile by mile until he became nothing more than an empty shell behind the steering wheel. The dreams were so vivid and disturbing that Gary eventually sought treatment from a psychologist who specialized in supernatural trauma. Dr. Elizabeth Warren was one of a small number of mental health professionals who had security clearance to treat victims of entity encounters, and she helped Gary understand that his nightmares were a normal response to the kind of traumatic experience he'd survived. "Your mind is trying to process an encounter with something that exists outside normal human experience," Dr. Warren explained during one of their sessions. "The nightmares are your psyche's attempt to make sense of what happened and to prepare you for similar encounters in the future. They're actually a healthy response, even though they're causing you distress." Dr. Warren taught Gary meditation techniques and cognitive behavioral strategies for managing his anxiety about highway travel. She also connected him with a support group for other survivors of supernatural encounters, people who had faced similar experiences with entities that preyed on isolated travelers, airline passengers, and other people who found themselves vulnerable while using America's transportation infrastructure. Through the support group, Gary met other truck drivers who had survived encounters with highway feeders, as well as victims of airport spirits, train phantoms, and other supernatural predators that used modern transportation systems as hunting grounds. He learned that his experience, while traumatic, was part of a much larger pattern of supernatural predation that had been affecting American travelers for decades. "The thing that helped me the most," said Frank Delacroix, a truck driver from Louisiana who had survived an encounter with a different highway feeder, "was realizing that we're part of something bigger than just our individual experiences. The information we provide to the federal investigators, the testimony we give about how these things operate, that's all being used to protect other drivers who might otherwise become victims." Gary found comfort in the knowledge that his encounter with Linda Morrison was contributing to a larger effort to protect commercial drivers from supernatural threats. The trauma he'd experienced had meaning beyond his personal suffering, and the ongoing investigation into highway feeders was making the roads safer for other truckers who might otherwise find themselves face to face with entities that could drain their life force and leave them as unexplained disappearances along remote stretches of highway. As the months passed, Gary gradually adjusted to his new life as the owner of a small auto repair business. He discovered that he enjoyed working with his hands, solving mechanical problems that had clear solutions and predictable outcomes. After spending years on the highway dealing with the uncertainties of weather, traffic, and delivery schedules, there was something deeply satisfying about the straightforward nature of automotive repair. But Gary never forgot the lessons that the highway had taught him about the hidden dangers that lurked just beyond the edge of normal human awareness. He understood that America's transportation system was more than just a network of roads and vehicles. It was a complex ecosystem where human commerce intersected with supernatural forces that most people never suspected existed. The experience had shown Gary that kindness and compassion, while admirable human qualities, could also be weaponized by predators who understood how to exploit the better angels of human nature. Linda Morrison had been able to trap him precisely because she had appealed to his desire to help someone in distress, turning his own moral instincts against him in a way that had nearly cost him his life. Gary's encounter with Linda had also revealed the existence of a hidden war being fought along America's highways, a conflict between human civilization and supernatural entities that viewed the interstate system as their personal hunting territory. Federal agents, working under classified legislation, were engaged in an ongoing effort to protect commercial drivers from threats that the general public never knew existed, using technology and investigative techniques specifically designed to counter supernatural predation. The knowledge that this hidden conflict was taking place gave Gary a new appreciation for the complexity of the world he'd been traveling through for nearly 2 decades without understanding its true nature. The highways he'd driven thousands of times carried more than just cargo and commerce. They carried secrets, mysteries, and dangers that existed in the spaces between the normal world and something far more sinister. But perhaps most importantly, Gary's experience had taught him that survival often depended on recognizing the signs of danger before it was too late to escape. The subtle inconsistencies in Linda's story, the way her reflection didn't match her appearance, the unexplained temperature changes in his truck's cab, all of these had been warning signs that something was wrong, clues that might have allowed him to escape if he'd understood their significance at the time. Gary made sure that other drivers knew about these warning signs. Through the support group and his contacts with federal investigators, he helped develop educational materials that taught truckers how to recognize the subtle indicators of supernatural encounters. His detailed recollections of Linda's behavior patterns became part of a training program that was being distributed to commercial drivers across the country, potentially saving lives by helping people recognize threats before they became victims. Years later, when Gary looked back on his encounter with Linda Morrison, he realized that it had been both the most terrifying and the most important experience of his life. The trauma he'd suffered had been real and lasting, but it had also served a purpose beyond his personal ordeal. His survival had contributed to a larger effort to protect other drivers from supernatural predators, and his testimony had helped law enforcement agencies develop better strategies for detecting and capturing entities that preyed on isolated travelers. The highway had taken something from Gary: his sense of safety, his ability to travel long distances without fear, his naive belief that the world contained only the dangers that could be seen and understood through normal human perception. But it had also given him something in return: the knowledge that there were people fighting to protect travelers from threats that most Americans never knew existed, and the satisfaction of knowing that his suffering had contributed to making the roads safer for others. Gary never drove long-haul routes again, but he never forgot the lessons that Interstate 40 had taught him about the true nature of America's highway system. The roads stretched on, endless and patient, carrying their cargo of mystery and menace. But now there were people watching those roads, federal agents and researchers who understood the hidden dangers that traveled the highways, and protocols in place to protect drivers who might otherwise become victims of entities that existed in the shadows between the normal world and something far more sinister. And somewhere in a maximum security facility designed for supernatural prisoners, Linda Morrison remained in custody. Her centuries-long career as a highway predator finally brought to an end by the combined efforts of federal law enforcement and one truck driver who had been willing to help a stranger in need, only to discover that not every passenger was entirely human. The interstate system wasn't just 48,000 miles of asphalt connecting cities. It was a battleground in an ongoing war between human civilization and supernatural forces that most people never suspected existed. And sometimes, the only thing standing between life and death was the knowledge that some dangers couldn't be seen until it was too late to escape, and that the greatest threat to travelers wasn't mechanical failure or bad weather, but the realization that some passengers weren't supposed to exist at all. Dennis Kowalski had always been meticulous about maintenance. In his 12 years of driving long-haul freight across America's highways, he'd never had a major breakdown, never missed a delivery deadline due to mechanical failure, and never found himself stranded on the roadside waiting for help that might never come. His 2018 Freightliner Cascadia was maintained like a Swiss watch. Every service performed exactly on schedule, every component inspected with religious precision, every potential problem addressed before it could become a crisis, which made what happened on the night of October 23, 2024, so completely inexplicable. Dennis was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Omaha to Phoenix, running his usual route through Colorado on Interstate 76 toward Denver, then south on I-25 through New Mexico. It was familiar territory that he'd covered hundreds of times, a reliable corridor that offered good fuel stops, predictable traffic patterns, and well-maintained roads that could handle the weight of his loaded trailer without stress on his equipment. The evening had started with perfect conditions, clear skies, moderate temperatures, and light traffic that allowed Dennis to maintain his preferred cruising speed of 65 miles per hour, while monitoring his fuel consumption and engine parameters through the advanced diagnostic systems that kept his truck running at peak efficiency. His electronic logs showed him exactly on schedule for a Phoenix delivery that would arrive with hours to spare, giving him flexibility in his route planning and rest stop timing. Dennis had departed Omaha at 4:00 p.m., timing his departure to put him through the most challenging mountain passes during daylight hours, when visibility was optimal and emergency services were most readily available. His trailer carried 44,000 pounds of farming implements destined for agricultural dealers throughout Arizona, plows, cultivators, and irrigation equipment that represented months of manufacturing work and hundreds of thousands of dollars in wholesale value. The load was properly distributed and secured. The trailer's air brakes and electrical systems had been thoroughly inspected, and Dennis's pre-trip checklist had revealed no issues that might compromise the safety or efficiency of his journey. He was running ahead of schedule. His fuel consumption was tracking perfectly with his calculations, and his truck's onboard diagnostics showed all systems operating within normal parameters. At 11:34 p.m., Dennis was climbing through the foothills of Colorado east of Denver when his engine began making a sound he'd never heard before. It started as a subtle irregularity in the diesel's normal rhythm, a slight hesitation that might have gone unnoticed by a less experienced driver. But Dennis had been listening to his engine for 12 years, and he knew every sound it made under every condition of load, weather, and terrain. This was something new, something wrong, something that made his stomach clench with the kind of dread that every professional driver carried in the back of his mind. Dennis immediately began running through his mental checklist of potential problems. Engine temperature was normal, oil pressure was steady, fuel levels were adequate, Air pressure in the brake system was holding constant. Nothing on his dashboard indicated any system failures or parameter deviations that might explain the irregular engine performance he was hearing. But the sound persisted, growing gradually more pronounced as he continued climbing the long grade that led toward the mountain passes. It wasn't the labored breathing of an engine working hard against gravity. Dennis knew that sound well, and this was something entirely different. It was an irregular knocking that seemed to come from deep within the engine block. A metallic percussion that suggested serious internal damage was developing in real time. Dennis began looking for a safe place to pull over and investigate the problem. The highway in this section ran through relatively unpopulated terrain, with exits spaced many miles apart and few facilities that could accommodate a commercial vehicle inspection. But his trucking instincts told him that continuing to drive with an engine that was making abnormal sounds was asking for catastrophic failure, the kind of breakdown that could leave him stranded in a location where help would be difficult to obtain. At mile marker 127, Dennis spotted a roadside rest area that appeared to offer enough space for him to safely park his truck and perform a preliminary diagnosis of whatever was causing the engine irregularities. The facility was small and isolated, without the amenities of a full truck stop, but it provided adequate parking and would allow him to pop his hood and check for obvious problems before deciding whether to continue his journey or call for roadside assistance. Dennis activated his hazard lights and carefully maneuvered his truck and trailer into the rest area, selecting a parking spot that would allow him to work on his engine without blocking other vehicles that might need to use the facility. As he brought his truck to a complete stop and engaged the parking brake, the engine irregularities became even more pronounced, confirming his decision to investigate the problem before attempting to continue toward Denver. The rest area was eerily quiet, with no other vehicles visible and no signs of recent use. A single functioning streetlight cast a pool of yellowish illumination over the parking area, leaving most of the facility in darkness that seemed to press in from the surrounding wilderness. Dennis could hear the wind moving through the pine trees that bordered the rest area and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. But otherwise, the night was filled with the kind of profound silence that was only possible in remote locations far from urban population centers. Dennis shut down his engine and climbed out of his cab to begin his inspection. The sudden silence was almost startling after hours of listening to the diesel's rhythm, and Dennis found himself acutely aware of how isolated he was in this remote rest area. The nearest town was more than 20 miles away. The interstate carried only occasional traffic at this hour, and his cell phone showed minimal signal strength that might not be adequate for calling roadside assistance if the problem turned out to be serious. But Dennis had been in similar situations before, and he'd always managed to either fix the problem himself or find help from other drivers who understood the brotherhood of the road. He approached his investigation with the methodical precision that had served him well throughout his career, starting with the most obvious potential causes and working toward more complex possibilities. Popping the hood revealed an engine compartment that looked exactly as it should, clean, well-maintained, with all components in their proper positions, and no obvious signs of damage or malfunction. Dennis checked the oil level and consistency, finding both normal. He examined the cooling system for leaks or pressure loss, discovering nothing unusual. He inspected the fuel lines, air intake system, and electrical connections, looking for any deviation from the perfect condition he expected from his meticulously maintained truck. Nothing was obviously wrong, yet Dennis knew that the sound he'd been hearing indicated a serious problem developing somewhere within the engine's internal components. It was the kind of issue that might require professional diagnosis with electronic testing equipment, or possibly even engine disassembly to identify the source of the irregular knocking that had forced him to stop. As Dennis stood beside his truck considering his options, headlights appeared on the access road leading into the rest area. A pickup truck pulled into the facility and parked near Dennis's rig, its occupants apparently noticing his open hood and concluding that he might need assistance. Dennis felt a mixture of relief and caution. Help was always welcome when dealing with mechanical problems in remote locations, But he'd also learned to be careful about accepting assistance from strangers whose motivations and qualifications were unknown. Two men climbed out of the pickup truck and approached Dennis with the casual friendliness that was common among travelers who encountered each other in remote locations. The driver appeared to be in his 40s, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap that suggested he was familiar with mechanical work. His passenger looked younger, perhaps in his 20s, with the kind of eager demeanor that suggested he was interested in learning about truck maintenance. "Having some trouble?" the older man asked, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Roy Peterson, and this is my nephew Alan. We were heading back from a hunting trip when we saw you pulled over with your hood up." Dennis shook hands with both men, grateful for the offer of assistance, even though he remained cautious about accepting help from strangers. "Dennis Kowalski. Yeah, I'm getting some irregular engine noise that started about 20 miles back. Nothing obvious under the hood, but something's definitely not right." Roy nodded knowingly. "I've been working on diesels for 30 years, ran a truck repair shop up in Cheyenne before I retired. Mind if I take a listen to your engine?" Dennis appreciated the offer from someone with relevant experience, and he started his truck to demonstrate the irregular knocking that had forced him to stop. Roy listened intently, his head cocked at an angle that suggested he was isolating specific sounds within the engine's complex acoustic signature. After a few minutes, he gestured for Dennis to shut down the engine and approached with the confidence of someone who'd diagnosed similar problems many times before. "I think I know what you're dealing with," Roy said. "Sounds like you've got a bearing that's starting to go bad. Probably the main bearing on cylinder number 4. It's not critical yet, but it will be if you keep driving without addressing it." Dennis felt his heart sink. A main bearing failure was exactly the kind of expensive, time-consuming repair that could strand him for days and cost thousands of dollars in parts and labor. Worse yet, continuing to drive with a failing bearing could cause catastrophic engine damage that would total his truck and end his career as an owner-operator. "How bad is it?" Dennis asked, hoping that Roy's diagnosis might offer some reason for optimism. "Well," Roy said, scratching his chin thoughtfully, "it's not going to get better on its own. But I think we might be able to help you out. Alan and I have a repair shop about 15 miles from here, just off Highway 34. We've got the tools and parts to rebuild that bearing tonight, get you back on the road by morning." Alan nodded enthusiastically. "Uncle Roy's shop has everything. Engine hoist, full set of precision tools, even the bearing specifications for your model of Freightliner. We could have you fixed up and running in maybe 6 hours, 7 at the outside." Dennis felt a surge of relief mixed with caution. The offer seemed almost too good to be true. Finding qualified diesel mechanics in a remote area at nearly midnight, with immediate availability and all the necessary parts in stock. But Roy's diagnosis had sounded knowledgeable and professional, and Dennis was certainly in no position to be choosy about offers of assistance. "That's incredibly generous," Dennis said. "What would you charge for something like that?" Roy waved his hand dismissively. "Let's worry about the money after we get you fixed up. Right now, the important thing is getting you back on the road safely. A main bearing failure isn't something you want to ignore. Could seize your whole engine if it lets go completely." Dennis considered his options. He could call his company's roadside assistance program, but help might not arrive until morning, and he'd still need to find a qualified repair facility that could handle major engine work. Roy's offer provided immediate assistance from someone who claimed relevant expertise, and the alternative was spending the night stranded in a remote rest area hoping that his engine would start in the morning. "All right," Dennis said finally. "I really appreciate this. How do we get my truck to your shop?" "I'll ride with you," Roy said. "Alan can follow in the pickup. The shop's only about 15 miles, mostly downhill, so your engine shouldn't be under too much stress. If we take it easy and keep the RPMs low, we should make it without causing any additional damage." Dennis climbed back into his cab while Roy settled into the passenger seat, providing directions as they pulled out of the rest area and back onto the highway. Alan followed in the pickup truck, his headlights visible in Dennis's mirrors as they formed a small convoy heading toward what Dennis hoped would be a solution to his mechanical problems. As they drove through the dark Colorado landscape, Roy kept up a steady stream of conversation about diesel engines, truck maintenance, and the challenges of keeping commercial vehicles running in mountain terrain. His knowledge seemed extensive and authentic, covering everything from fuel injection timing to turbocharger maintenance with the kind of detailed understanding that came from decades of hands-on experience. "I started working on trucks when they were still all mechanical," Roy explained. "Before electronic fuel injection, before computer diagnostics, when you had to actually listen to an engine and feel what it was telling you. These modern trucks are more reliable, but they're also more complex. Sometimes the old-school diagnostic techniques are still the best way to identify problems." Dennis found Roy's conversation reassuring, confirming his impression that the man genuinely possessed the expertise necessary to diagnose and repair the engine problem that had forced him to stop. The directions Roy provided led them off the interstate onto a state highway that wound through increasingly remote terrain, past small communities that appeared to be mostly asleep at this late hour. "How long have you had your shop out here?" Dennis asked as they drove through a particularly isolated stretch of highway. "About 20 years now," Roy replied. "Started it after I got tired of working for other people in Cheyenne. Out here, I can set my own hours, choose my own customers, really focus on quality work instead of just turning wrenches as fast as possible." The landscape around them grew progressively more desolate as they continued following Roy's directions. Dennis began to notice that the businesses and residences along the highway appeared to be abandoned, with darkened windows and overgrown parking lots that suggested they'd been empty for years. Even the highway itself seemed to be in poor repair, with potholes and cracked pavement that indicated minimal maintenance attention. "Not much development out this way," Dennis observed, beginning to feel slightly uneasy about the isolation of their destination. "That's exactly why I like it," Roy said. "No neighbors to complain about noise, no zoning inspectors poking around, no city regulations telling me how to run my business. Just peace and quiet, and all the space I need to work on trucks properly." After nearly 30 minutes of driving through increasingly remote terrain, Roy directed Dennis to turn onto a gravel road that led away from the state highway into what appeared to be completely undeveloped wilderness. The road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for Dennis's truck and trailer, with pine trees pressing close on both sides that created a tunnel effect in his headlights. "Are you sure this is right?" Dennis asked, growing more concerned about their destination with each mile they traveled into the wilderness. "Just a little further," Roy assured him. "The shop's set back from the main road for privacy. Don't worry, we'll have you fixed up in no time." Dennis began to regret his decision to follow Roy to this remote location. Every instinct he'd developed during 12 years of professional driving was telling him that something was wrong with this situation. Legitimate truck repair shops didn't operate in the middle of wilderness areas, accessible only by rough gravel roads that would make it difficult for customers to find them or for parts suppliers to make deliveries. But Dennis was committed now, following the gravel road deeper into the forest with Alan's pickup truck still visible in his mirrors. Turning around would be difficult with his 53-foot trailer, and Roy continued to provide confident directions that suggested they were approaching their destination. After what felt like an eternity of rough driving, Dennis's headlights illuminated a cluster of buildings in a clearing ahead. The facility appeared to be exactly what Roy had described: a truck repair shop with multiple bays, an office building, and several pieces of heavy equipment that would be necessary for major engine work. Dennis felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease as he maneuvered his truck into the position that Roy indicated. "Welcome to Peterson's Diesel Repair," Roy said as Dennis shut down his engine. "Best truck shop in Colorado, even if we are a little hard to find." Dennis climbed down from his cab and looked around the facility, trying to assess whether his concerns about the remote location had been justified. The shop appeared well-equipped and professional, with modern lift equipment and tool arrays that suggested serious mechanical capability. But something about the atmosphere felt wrong in ways that Dennis couldn't immediately identify. The buildings were dark except for a few security lights that cast harsh shadows across the work areas. No other vehicles were visible, which was unusual for a truck repair facility that would typically have several customer vehicles in various stages of repair. Most significantly, the entire facility was completely silent. No background noise from air compressors, hydraulic systems, or other equipment that would normally be running even during off hours. Alan had parked his pickup and was already opening one of the shop bays, gesturing for Dennis to back his truck into the service area. Roy supervised the parking process with the professional competence Dennis had expected, using hand signals to guide the truck and trailer into perfect position for engine work. "This is really impressive," Dennis said, looking around the shop bay that appeared to contain every tool and piece of equipment necessary for major truck repairs. "You must do a lot of business to justify this kind of setup." "We stay busy," Roy replied, but his answer seemed evasive. "A lot of truckers have problems in these mountains, especially during winter. We built this place to handle any kind of repair work that might come up." As Dennis surveyed the shop more carefully, he began to notice details that didn't match Roy's description of a busy, successful repair business. The tools, while extensive, showed no signs of recent use, no oil stains, no wear patterns, no accumulation of the grime that would be inevitable in an active truck repair facility. The work surfaces were spotlessly clean in a way that suggested they hadn't been used for actual repair work in a very long time. Most troubling of all, Dennis began to see signs that the shop had been specifically prepared for his arrival. Tool sets had been laid out in patterns that suggested advanced planning rather than routine readiness. Parts catalogs were open to sections that corresponded exactly to his truck's engine specifications. Even the shop lighting had been arranged to illuminate his truck's engine compartment with the precision of a stage production. "How did you know what parts to have ready?" Dennis asked, his unease growing stronger as he noticed more evidence of premeditation. "Experience," Roy said, but his answer came a little too quickly. "After 30 years of working on diesels, you learn to anticipate what kind of problems truckers are likely to have. Main bearing failures on freightliners are pretty common in mountain terrain." Dennis wanted to believe Roy's explanation, but his instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. He'd never heard of main bearing failures being particularly common on freightliner engines, and the shop's level of preparation suggested knowledge of his specific problem that went beyond general experience. "Maybe I should call my dispatcher and let them know where I am," Dennis said, reaching for his cell phone. "Company policy requires me to report any major delays or route changes." "No signal out here," Alan said immediately. "We're in a dead zone between cell towers, but don't worry about it. We'll have you back on the road long before your dispatcher expects to hear from you." Dennis checked his phone and confirmed that Alan was correct. No signal bars, no data connection, no way to communicate with the outside world. He was completely isolated in this remote repair facility, dependent on Roy and Alan for both mechanical assistance and eventual departure. Roy had already begun removing the access panels that would allow him to examine Dennis's engine in detail. His movements were confident and practiced, suggesting genuine familiarity with truck maintenance procedures. But Dennis noticed that Roy was working without the diagnostic procedures that would normally precede major engine work. No computer scans, no systematic testing, no attempt to verify the problem before beginning disassembly. "Shouldn't you run some diagnostics before you start taking things apart?" Dennis asked. "I can tell what's wrong just by listening," Roy replied. "That's the advantage of 30 years' experience. You learn to trust your ears more than computers." As Roy continued working on the engine, Dennis became increasingly aware that Alan was positioning himself between Dennis and the shop exit, not in an obviously threatening way, but with the subtle body language of someone who was prepared to prevent departure if necessary. When Dennis moved toward the shop bay opening to get better cell phone reception, Alan casually moved to block his path while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. "Uncle Roy's really something with engines," Alan said, his tone friendly but his positioning deliberate. "I've seen him diagnose problems that had other mechanics completely stumped. You're lucky we happened to be driving by when your truck broke down." Dennis was beginning to suspect that his encounter with Roy and Alan hadn't been the fortunate coincidence they'd presented it as. The timing of their appearance at the rest area, their immediate offer of assistance, and the preparedness of their shop all suggested a level of planning that went beyond chance encounters between strangers on remote highways. "How often do you guys patrol that rest area looking for stranded truckers?" Dennis asked, trying to sound casual while probing for information about their actual activities. "We don't patrol anywhere," Roy said from under the hood. "We were just heading home from our hunting trip when we saw you having trouble. Sometimes you get lucky and find help exactly when you need it." But Dennis was no longer convinced that luck had anything to do with his situation. He began to notice other details that suggested Roy and Alan's story didn't match the evidence around him. Their clothes showed no signs of having been on a hunting trip. No dirt, no outdoor odors, no hunting licenses or gear visible in their pickup truck. Their hands were clean and uncalloused in a way that didn't match Roy's claims of 30 years working as a diesel mechanic. Most significantly, Dennis realized that he hadn't actually seen any evidence that Roy possessed the mechanical expertise he claimed. The man was confidently dismantling engine components, but his techniques seemed more focused on creating the appearance of repair work than on actually diagnosing or fixing problems. "What exactly did you find wrong with the bearing?" Dennis asked, hoping to test Roy's claimed expertise with specific technical questions. "Classic wear pattern," Roy replied without looking up from his work. "Metal fatigue combined with insufficient lubrication. Pretty typical for trucks that spend a lot of time in mountain terrain." Dennis knew enough about diesel engines to recognize that Roy's explanation was generic enough to apply to almost any mechanical problem. It was the kind of vague response someone might give if they wanted to sound knowledgeable without actually possessing detailed understanding of engine diagnostics. As the hours passed, Dennis became increasingly convinced that he was not in a legitimate truck repair facility, but rather in some kind of trap that had been specifically designed to capture isolated truckers who found themselves stranded in remote locations. Roy and Alan's behavior, while superficially helpful, showed too many signs of premeditation and deception to be genuine assistance. The final confirmation came when Dennis noticed that Roy was not actually repairing his engine, but rather systematically dismantling it in ways that would make it impossible to start. Components were being removed and set aside rather than repaired or replaced, and critical connections were being disconnected in patterns that suggested sabotage rather than maintenance. "What are you really doing to my truck?" Dennis demanded, no longer willing to maintain the pretense of grateful cooperation. Roy straightened up from his work and looked at Dennis with an expression that had lost all pretense of friendliness. "I'm making sure you won't be leaving here anytime soon," he said. "See, Dennis, we've been watching you for a while now. Your route, your schedule, your cargo manifest. We know all about that expensive agricultural equipment you're hauling." Alan moved closer to Dennis, his casual demeanor replaced by something more obviously threatening. "You're going to help us transfer that cargo to our truck," he said. "Then you're going to disappear, and your truck is going to have an unfortunate accident that makes it look like you went off the road somewhere in the mountains." Dennis realized that he had walked into an elaborate theft operation that used fake mechanical problems and offers of roadside assistance to lure truckers to this remote location where their cargo could be stolen and their trucks dismantled for parts. Roy and Alan weren't good Samaritans. They were predators who had perfected a system for identifying and capturing valuable loads while eliminating the drivers who could identify them. "How many drivers have you done this to?" Dennis asked, stalling for time while he tried to figure out how to escape from the shop. "Enough to make a good living," Roy replied. "Truck cargo is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and most of it travels through remote areas where drivers are vulnerable to exactly the kind of assistance we provide. Insurance companies write off the losses, shipping companies adjust their rates, and nobody looks too hard for drivers who disappear in mountain terrain." Dennis understood that he was in mortal danger. Roy and Alan had clearly done this before, and they had no intention of allowing him to leave their facility alive. His truck was being systematically disabled, his cargo was about to be stolen, and he was about to become another unsolved disappearance along America's highway system. But Dennis also realized that Roy and Alan had made at least one crucial mistake in their planning. They had assumed that he would be completely helpless once they revealed their true intentions, but Dennis had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation throughout his career as a truck driver. Hidden in his cab was a loaded .38 revolver that he carried for protection during runs through remote areas where law enforcement response times could be measured in hours rather than minutes. The gun was legally owned and properly licensed, and Dennis had practiced with it regularly at shooting ranges near his home base in Illinois. "I need to get something from my truck," Dennis said, trying to sound defeated and cooperative. "Nothing in that truck belongs to you anymore," Alan replied. "Everything in there is ours now, your cargo, your equipment, even your personal belongings." But Dennis had already spotted his opportunity. Roy was bent over the engine compartment with his back turned, and Alan was standing just close enough to be reached with a quick lunge. Dennis feinted toward his truck as if he was going to comply with Alan's demands, then suddenly changed direction and tackled the younger man with all his strength. The collision sent both men crashing into a tool cabinet, and Dennis used the confusion to sprint toward his cab where his revolver was hidden beneath the driver's seat. Alan was shouting for Roy's help, but Dennis reached his truck and retrieved his weapon before either of his captors could stop him. "Both of you step back," Dennis commanded, pointing the revolver at Roy and Alan while keeping his distance from both men. "I'm walking out of here, and if either of you tries to stop me, I'll shoot." Roy and Alan exchanged glances that suggested they were considering whether to rush Dennis despite his weapon. But Dennis had positioned himself strategically, with clear lines of sight to both men and multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated further. "You can't just leave," Roy said. "We know who you are, where you live, what routes you travel. If you walk away from here, we'll find you eventually." "Maybe," Dennis replied. "But tonight you're going to let me go, and you're going to stay right here while I drive away." Dennis began backing toward the shop exit, keeping his weapon trained on Roy and Alan while monitoring their positions to ensure they couldn't flank him or block his escape route. His truck keys were in his pocket, and he was confident that he could start his engine and drive away, even with the maintenance work that Roy had performed. "Your truck won't make it 10 miles, Alan said. "Uncle Roy disconnected half the systems. You'll break down before you reach the main highway." "Then I'll walk," Dennis replied. "But I'm not staying here to become another one of your victims." As Dennis reached the shop exit, Roy made a sudden move toward a tool cabinet that might have contained additional weapons. Dennis fired a warning shot into the shop ceiling, the sound echoing through the metal building with enough volume to make both men freeze in place. "Don't test me," Dennis said. "I've been carrying this gun for 12 years, and I know how to use it." Dennis continued backing toward his truck, watching Roy and Alan carefully for any sign that they might attempt to rush him or produce weapons of their own. The shop was filled with potential weapons: wrenches, hammers, cutting tools. But Dennis's revolver gave him a decisive advantage as long as he maintained distance and situational awareness. Reaching his truck, Dennis climbed into the cab while keeping his weapon visible and pointed toward the shop. His engine turned over normally despite Roy's sabotage attempts, and the diesel caught immediately with the reliable response that had characterized his truck throughout its maintenance history. As Dennis began driving toward the exit, he saw Roy and Alan running toward their pickup truck, apparently intending to pursue him despite his armed departure. Dennis knew that his truck would be slower than their pickup on the rough gravel road, and he might not be able to maintain his lead all the way back to the main highway. But Dennis had one advantage that Roy and Alan hadn't considered. His truck's electronic logging system included a GPS transponder that recorded his location continuously, even when he was out of cell phone range. The data was automatically uploaded to his company's servers whenever he regained connectivity, creating a permanent record of everywhere he traveled. If Roy and Alan caught up with him and carried out their threats, the GPS data would lead investigators directly to their shop, providing evidence that would end their operation and result in their prosecution for kidnapping, theft, and murder. They might be able to kill Dennis, but they wouldn't be able to cover up the electronic trail that led directly to their facility. Dennis's truck reached the main highway just as Roy and Alan's pickup emerged from the gravel road behind him. But instead of pursuing him further, they stopped at the intersection and watched as Dennis drove away toward civilization and safety. Apparently, they had realized the same thing Dennis had understood. His GPS tracking system would lead authorities directly to them if anything happened to him. As Dennis drove toward the nearest town with cell phone coverage, he began to understand the full scope of what he had escaped. Roy and Alan were operating a sophisticated cargo theft ring that used fake mechanical problems and offers of roadside assistance to lure truckers to their remote facility. Once there, drivers would be robbed, their trucks would be stripped for parts, and the drivers themselves would disappear into the Colorado wilderness. Dennis's escape had disrupted their operation and exposed their location, but he realized that there might be other truckers who hadn't been as fortunate. How many drivers had accepted Roy's offer of assistance over the years? How many had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind unsolved missing person cases and insurance claims for stolen cargo? When Dennis finally regained cell phone coverage, he immediately called 911 to report his encounter with Roy and Alan. Within hours, law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions were coordinating a response to the remote shop where Dennis had nearly become another victim of highway predators. The subsequent investigation revealed that Peterson's diesel repair was indeed a front for a cargo theft operation that had been active for more than 5 years. Roy Peterson and Alan Morrison were career criminals who had developed an elaborate system for identifying valuable loads, disabling trucks, stealing cargo, and eliminating witnesses. The shop contained evidence linking Roy and Alan to at least 12 unsolved trucker disappearances across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. Parts from stolen trucks, personal belongings from missing drivers, and detailed records of cargo manifests and shipping schedules painted a picture of an operation that had been systematically preying on isolated truckers for years. Dennis's GPS tracking data provided the crucial evidence that led authorities to the remote facility, and his detailed description of Roy and Alan's methods helped investigators understand how the operation worked. But the case also revealed how vulnerable truckers were to predators who understood the isolation and mechanical vulnerabilities of long-haul freight operations. The highway had taught Dennis that not all offers of assistance came from genuine Good Samaritans, and that sometimes the greatest danger came from people who understood exactly how to exploit a trucker's need for help in remote locations. The roads carried more than just cargo and commerce. They carried predators who had learned to use the highway system as a hunting ground where isolated drivers could be captured and killed without witnesses or immediate law enforcement response. Dennis returned to trucking after his encounter with Roy and Alan, but he never again accepted help from strangers in remote locations. He carried additional communication equipment, traveled with other drivers whenever possible, and maintained his weapon training at a level that would allow him to defend himself against future predators. The highway had shown Dennis that the greatest threats to truckers often came not from mechanical failures or weather conditions, but from human predators who had learned to use the isolation and vulnerability of the road to their advantage. America's transportation system was more than just a network of roads. It was an ecosystem where legitimate commerce had to coexist with criminal operations that preyed on the very drivers who kept the economy moving. But Dennis had also learned that survival often depended on trusting instincts and being prepared to fight back when help turned into a trap. The roads would always carry both legitimate assistance and criminal predation, and the difference between life and death often came down to recognizing which was which before it was too late to escape. The investigation into Peterson's diesel repair continued for months as law enforcement agencies worked to identify all the victims of Roy and Alan's operation. Dennis was called back repeatedly to provide testimony and help investigators understand the methods the criminals had used to lure truckers to their remote facility. Each session revealed new details about the sophistication of the operation and the number of drivers who had fallen victim to their fake offers of assistance. They had been planning this for years. Detective Sarah Mitchell from the Colorado State Police explained to Dennis during one of their interviews. The shop was specifically designed to look legitimate while being equipped for cargo theft and body disposal. They had studied trucker behavior, route patterns, and the kinds of mechanical problems that would force drivers to seek help in remote locations. The evidence collected from the facility painted a picture of an operation that was far more extensive than Dennis had initially realized. Roy and Alan had been monitoring CB radio traffic to identify valuable loads, following potential targets for hundreds of miles to learn their routes and schedules, and even sabotaging trucks at rest stops to create the mechanical problems that would force drivers to seek assistance. Your case was actually unusual, Detective Mitchell continued. Most of their victims were lured to the shop after real mechanical failures that Roy and Alan had caused. They would tamper with trucks while drivers were sleeping or eating, then follow them until the sabotage caused a breakdown in a location where they could offer help. Dennis learned that his truck had indeed been sabotaged, but not in the way he'd initially suspected. Roy and Alan had tampered with his engine at a truck stop nearly 50 miles before the rest area where they'd found him having trouble. They had used a remote-controlled device to create the irregular engine sounds that had forced him to pull over, timing the breakdown to occur in the exact location where they could conveniently appear to offer assistance. They called it controlled failures, Detective Mitchell explained. They would plant devices that could create specific mechanical symptoms at predetermined times and locations. The device in your truck was designed to produce engine knock sounds without actually damaging the engine, at least not initially. If you had continued driving, it would have eventually caused real damage that would have stranded you anyway. The sophistication of Roy and Alan's operation extended far beyond simple mechanical sabotage. They had been studying truck maintenance schedules, fuel stop patterns, and driver behavior for years, developing profiles of truckers who would be most vulnerable to their assistance scam. They targeted drivers who traveled regular routes through remote areas, hauled high-value cargo, and operated as independent owner-operators without the corporate backup that larger trucking companies provided. They knew everything about you before they approached you that night, Detective Mitchell revealed. Your route history, your cargo manifest, even your personal background and family situation. They had been tracking you for over a month, waiting for the right opportunity to set their trap. Dennis felt a chill as he realized how thoroughly he had been stalked by predators who understood his profession better than most legitimate truckers. Roy and Alan had turned the highways into a hunting ground where they could identify, track, and capture victims with the precision of a military operation. The evidence recovered from their facility revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. They had detailed files on more than 200 truckers, complete with photographs, route information, cargo data, and personal details that would allow them to target specific drivers for robbery and murder. The operation had been generating millions of dollars in stolen cargo over the 5 years it had been active, with the agricultural equipment Dennis had been hauling representing just one of dozens of valuable loads they had successfully stolen. The really disturbing part, Detective Mitchell continued, is how they disposed of their victims. We found remains of at least 15 different drivers buried around the shop property. These men had families, mortgages, businesses. They were just trying to make a living, and Roy and Alan killed them for cargo that was probably worth less than the drivers' lives. The investigation also revealed how Roy and Alan had been able to operate for so long without detection. They had carefully studied law enforcement patterns in remote areas, timing their operations to avoid periods when state patrol units were likely to be conducting highway monitoring. They had also established relationships with corrupt officials in several jurisdictions, paying bribes to ensure that missing trucker reports would be minimally investigated. Highway crime is unfortunately common, Detective Mitchell explained. Truck drivers disappear regularly due to accidents, medical emergencies, or personal problems. When a truck is found abandoned in a remote area with no sign of the driver, authorities typically assume the driver wandered off seeking help and succumbed to exposure or wildlife. Without a body or clear evidence of foul play, these cases often remain unsolved indefinitely. Dennis began to understand how the highway system had become a perfect environment for predators like Roy and Alan. The vast distances, remote locations, and isolation of truck drivers created opportunities for criminals who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of commercial transportation. Truckers were attractive targets because they carried valuable cargo, traveled predictable routes, and often found themselves stranded in locations where help was hours away. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts revealed that Roy and Alan had been motivated by more than just financial gain. They had developed a pathological hatred of truck drivers, viewing them as outsiders who invaded their rural territory and threatened their way of life. The theft and murder operation had become a way for them to exercise control over the highway corridor they considered their domain. They saw themselves as predators at the top of the food chain, explained Dr. Robert Chen, a criminal psychologist who had interviewed both men after their arrest. In their minds, truck drivers were intruders who deserved whatever happened to them for traveling through their territory. The financial benefits were secondary to the psychological satisfaction they derived from dominating and destroying people they viewed as enemies. Dennis learned that Roy's claims of mechanical expertise had been entirely fabricated. He had no formal training in diesel engine repair and had never operated a legitimate truck shop. His knowledge came from years of studying trucking operations, specifically to develop more effective methods of disabling vehicles and trapping drivers. Alan was actually his son, not his nephew, and had been trained from adolescence to participate in the family's criminal enterprise. The whole Peterson's diesel repair identity was constructed specifically for this operation, Detective Mitchell revealed. They had fake business licenses, fraudulent insurance policies, even a website that made them appear to be a legitimate truck repair facility. But it was all designed to support their criminal activities. The investigation expanded to include other states where Roy and Alan had been active, revealing a network of similar operations that preyed on truck drivers throughout the Mountain West. Dennis's case had exposed just one cell of a larger criminal organization that had been systematically targeting commercial drivers for decades. Federal investigators discovered that Roy and Alan were part of a loosely organized group of criminals who shared information about valuable loads, vulnerable drivers, and effective methods for truck hijacking and driver elimination. The network included corrupt truck stop employees who provided inside information, police officers who suppressed investigations, and even some trucking company personnel who sold route and cargo data to criminal organizations. Your escape disrupted more than just Roy and Alan's operation, FBI agent Maria Santos explained to Dennis. The GPS tracking data from your truck led us to communications equipment that revealed the existence of the entire network. We've been able to identify and arrest more than 40 people involved in truck driver murders across 7 states. Dennis began to realize that his survival had implications far beyond his personal safety. By escaping from Roy and Alan's trap, he had exposed a criminal network that had been responsible for hundreds of trucker disappearances over the past 2 decades. His GPS tracking data had provided the crucial evidence needed to unravel the entire organization and bring justice to families who had been wondering for years what had happened to their missing relatives. The trial of Roy Peterson and Alan Morrison became a landmark case in the prosecution of highway predators. Dennis testified extensively about his experience, providing detailed descriptions of their methods and helping prosecutors understand how the operation had been designed to exploit trucker vulnerabilities. The defendants created an elaborate deception designed to exploit the natural tendency of truck drivers to help each other in remote locations, Prosecutor Janet Walsh explained in her opening statement. They used the isolation and mechanical vulnerabilities inherent in long-haul trucking to create opportunities for robbery and murder that went undetected for years. Roy and Alan's defense attorneys attempted to portray their clients as small-time criminals who had gotten in over their heads, but the evidence of premeditation and systematic targeting of victims made it clear that they were sophisticated predators who had turned truck driver murder into a profitable business model. The physical evidence recovered from their facility told a story of calculated brutality that extended far beyond simple robbery. Personal belongings from missing drivers had been kept as trophies, and detailed records showed that Roy and Alan had taken photographs of their victims both before and after killing them. They had been collecting evidence of their crimes as if they were building a portfolio of their success as highway predators. These men weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse, Prosecutor Walsh continued. They were organized killers who had developed a systematic approach to identifying, capturing, and murdering truck drivers. The evidence shows that they derived pleasure from the process of trapping and killing their victims, treating human beings as prey animals in an elaborate hunting operation. Dennis's testimony proved crucial in establishing the timeline and methods used by Roy and Alan. His detailed recollection of the night he was captured, combined with the GPS data from his truck, provided prosecutors with a minute-by-minute account of how the operation worked. His description of the fake repair shop and the equipment used to create the illusion of legitimate mechanical work helped investigators understand how other victims had been deceived and trapped. Mr. Kowalski's survival allowed us to understand exactly how these criminals operated, Prosecutor Walsh explained to the jury. Without his testimony, we would have had only circumstantial evidence of their crimes. His detailed account of their methods provides the missing piece that connects all the other evidence into a coherent picture of systematic predation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and conspiracy. Roy Peterson was sentenced to death, while Alan Morrison received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences reflected the severity of their crimes and the impact their operation had on the trucking industry and the families of their victims. Dennis attended the sentencing hearing, where he had the opportunity to address Roy and Alan directly. "You turned the highways into a hunting ground where honest drivers couldn't trust offers of help," he told them. "You destroyed families, ended careers, and made every truck driver who travels remote routes wonder if the next person offering assistance might be planning to kill them." The impact of the Peterson case extended far beyond the conviction of 2 criminals. It led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies investigated trucker disappearances and how the trucking industry approached driver safety in remote locations. New protocols were developed for GPS tracking, emergency communications, and driver check-in procedures that would make it more difficult for similar operations to succeed in the future. The Peterson case was a wake-up call for everyone involved in commercial transportation, explained Tom Bradley, director of the American Trucking Association's Safety Division. It showed us that truck drivers face threats that go far beyond mechanical failures and weather conditions. There are organized criminals who have turned highway predation into a systematic business model. New training programs were developed to help drivers recognize the signs of criminal deception and avoid situations where they might be vulnerable to predators like Roy and Alan. Drivers were taught to verify the legitimacy of repair facilities, maintain communication with dispatchers during breakdowns, and carry defensive equipment that could help them escape from dangerous situations. The most important lesson from Dennis Kowalski's experience, Bradley continued, is that drivers need to trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right. Roy and Alan were skilled at creating convincing deceptions, but there were warning signs that Dennis recognized and acted upon. That's what saved his life. Dennis became a frequent speaker at trucking industry conferences, sharing his experience and helping other drivers understand the realities of highway predation. His story became part of mandatory safety training for new drivers, and his survival strategies were incorporated into best practices guidelines for handling breakdowns in remote locations. "I never wanted to become known as the guy who survived a trucker murder attempt," Dennis reflected during one of his speaking engagements. "But if sharing my experience helps other drivers avoid similar situations, then something positive comes out of what was the worst night of my life." The ripple effects of Dennis's escape continued to unfold for years after Roy and Alan's conviction. Law enforcement agencies developed new investigative protocols specifically designed to identify highway predator operations, and federal funding was allocated for improved communication infrastructure in remote areas where truckers were most vulnerable. The case also led to legislative changes that made it easier for prosecutors to pursue charges against criminals who targeted commercial drivers. New federal laws established enhanced penalties for crimes committed against truck drivers, recognizing that attacks on commercial transportation affected interstate commerce and national economic security. The Peterson case demonstrated that highway crime is not just a local law enforcement issue, explained Congressman Robert Davis, who sponsored federal legislation inspired by Dennis's experience. When criminals systematically target truck drivers, they're attacking the transportation infrastructure that keeps our economy functioning. We needed federal tools to combat this kind of organized predation. Dennis continued driving for several more years after his encounter with Roy and Alan, but he never again traveled alone through remote areas without extensive safety precautions. He carried multiple communication devices, maintained constant contact with other drivers, and established check-in protocols with his family and dispatcher that would alert authorities immediately if he failed to report his location as scheduled. "The highway was never the same for me after that night," Dennis admitted. "Every offer of help, every breakdown, every isolated rest stop became a potential threat that I had to evaluate carefully. The innocence of trusting fellow travelers was gone forever." But Dennis also found that his experience had connected him to a community of drivers who had faced similar threats and survived. Through trucking forums, safety organizations, and law enforcement networks, he met other drivers who had encountered highway predators and lived to tell their stories. These connections helped him process the trauma of his experience and find meaning in his survival. "There's a brotherhood among drivers who have faced these kinds of threats," Dennis explained. "We understand what it's like to realize that not everyone offering help on the highway has good intentions. We look out for each other in ways that other drivers might not understand." The legacy of Dennis's encounter with Roy and Alan extended beyond the trucking industry to influence how law enforcement agencies approached missing person cases in general. The realization that systematic predation could masquerade as assistance led to new investigative techniques that were applied to cases involving missing hikers, stranded motorists, and other vulnerable travelers. The Peterson case changed how we think about predator behavior in transportation corridors, explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Sarah Kim. It showed us that criminals can develop sophisticated operations that exploit the natural human tendency to seek and offer help during emergencies. We now look for these patterns in other contexts where people might be vulnerable to fake assistance scams. Dennis's survival also contributed to advances in vehicle tracking technology and emergency communication systems that made it more difficult for criminals to isolate and trap victims. GPS tracking became more sophisticated, communication dead zones were mapped and addressed, and new protocols were developed for automatic alerts when vehicles deviated from planned routes. Technology can't prevent all criminal activity, explained automotive safety engineer Lisa Chen, but it can make it much more difficult for predators to operate without detection. Dennis's case showed us specific vulnerabilities in our transportation monitoring systems, and we've worked to address those gaps. Years later, Dennis reflected on how his encounter with Roy and Alan had changed not just his own life, but the entire trucking industry's approach to driver safety. What had started as a simple mechanical breakdown had evolved into a landmark case that exposed a hidden world of highway predation and led to fundamental changes in how drivers, law enforcement, and technology companies approach transportation security. I never expected that one night of terror would lead to all these changes, Dennis said during a retrospective interview 10 years after his escape. But I'm proud that my survival helped protect other drivers from going through what I experienced. The highway is still dangerous, but it's safer now because people understand the threats and know how to recognize them. Dennis eventually retired from trucking and opened a driving school that specialized in teaching safety and defensive techniques to new commercial drivers. His curriculum included extensive training on recognizing criminal deception, avoiding vulnerable situations, and responding to threats with the kind of decisive action that had saved his life. Every student who graduates from my program knows Dennis's story, explained driving instructor Carol Martinez. They understand that the highway carries more than just cargo. It carries predators who have learned to exploit driver vulnerabilities. That knowledge might save their lives someday. The impact of Dennis's encounter with Roy and Alan Peterson continued to resonate throughout the transportation industry, serving as a reminder that the highways were more than just routes connecting cities. They were complex ecosystems where legitimate commerce coexisted with criminal predation, where offers of assistance could be traps, and where survival often depended on the ability to recognize danger before it was too late to escape. The roads stretched on, endless and patient, carrying their cargo of mystery and menace. But now they also carried the knowledge that Dennis Kowalski had paid for with his terror, the understanding that not all Good Samaritans were good, and that sometimes the greatest threat to a driver's safety came not from mechanical failure or weather conditions, but from the willingness to trust strangers who offered help in moments of vulnerability. Dennis had learned that the highway was more than just a transportation network. It was a battleground where human predators used the isolation and mechanical dependencies of trucking to create opportunities for robbery and murder. But his survival had also shown that these predators could be defeated by drivers who trusted their instincts, prepared for the worst, and refused to become victims, even when trapped in seemingly hopeless situations. The interstate system wasn't just 48,000 miles of asphalt connecting cities. It was a hunting ground where predators moved freely between jurisdictions, targeting isolated drivers with the patience and precision of professional killers. And sometimes, the only thing standing between life and death was the knowledge that some offers of help were too good to be true, and that the greatest danger came not from strangers who ignored you, but from strangers who seemed too eager to help. Carl's experience had proven that the road could break a person's mind as easily as it could break their truck, and that the greatest enemy a driver might face wasn't mechanical failure or bad weather, but the gradual dissolution of their ability to distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. The highway carried more than just cargo and commerce. It carried the potential for psychological transformation that could destroy lives or, with proper intervention and treatment, lead to new understanding of the human mind's vulnerability and resilience. The investigation into Carl's breakdown revealed disturbing patterns within the trucking industry that suggested his experience was not unique. Federal transportation safety officials discovered that psychological breakdowns among long-haul drivers were significantly more common than previously documented, with many cases being misclassified as simple fatigue or substance abuse rather than recognized as complex psychological crises requiring specialized treatment. Mr. Henderson's case opened our eyes to a hidden epidemic of psychological distress among commercial drivers, explained Dr. Janet Walsh, a federal transportation safety researcher who studied Carl's medical records and GPS tracking data. We found that the combination of financial pressure, sleep deprivation, and stimulant abuse creates a perfect storm for psychological breakdown that affects thousands of drivers every year. The research revealed that owner-operators like Carl were particularly vulnerable to psychological crisis because they faced direct financial consequences for any lost driving time. Unlike company drivers who received steady wages regardless of their productivity, owner-operators were paid only for completed miles, creating incentives to violate safety regulations and push themselves beyond sustainable limits. The economic structure of owner-operator trucking essentially rewards dangerous behavior, Dr. Walsh continued. Drivers who follow hours of service regulations and get adequate sleep earn less money than those who violate the rules and stay awake longer. This creates a system where psychological breakdown becomes an occupational hazard rather than an individual failing. Carl's case also highlighted the role of pharmaceutical networks within the trucking industry. Informal systems where drivers shared stimulants, sleeping pills, and other medications to help them manage the physical and psychological demands of long-haul driving. These networks operated outside official medical supervision, with drivers self-medicating based on advice from other drivers rather than qualified healthcare providers. The pharmaceutical culture among truckers is essentially a form of collective self-medication, explained Dr. Robert Chen, a substance abuse specialist who interviewed Carl during his recovery. Drivers share drugs the same way they share information about routes or mechanical problems, without understanding the psychological risks they're creating. The combination of financial pressure, sleep deprivation, and unregulated drug use created conditions that were almost guaranteed to produce psychological breakdown in vulnerable individuals. Carl's 3-week descent into paranoid psychosis followed a pattern that researchers found in dozens of similar cases involving drivers who had been pushed beyond their psychological limits by the demands of modern trucking. What makes these cases so dangerous is that the psychological breakdown occurs gradually, often over weeks or months, Dr. Chen explained. Drivers don't suddenly become psychotic. They slowly lose touch with reality while continuing to operate commercial vehicles on public highways. By the time the breakdown becomes obvious, they may have been driving in a hallucinatory state for days. Carl's GPS tracking data provided researchers with unprecedented insight into how psychological breakdown affected driving performance. The electronic records showed that his route deviations, speed variations, and erratic lane changes had been increasing for more than 2 weeks before his final crisis, suggesting that his psychological deterioration had been affecting his driving long before he was found by law enforcement. The data shows that Mr. Henderson was a danger to public safety for at least 14 days before his breakdown was recognized, Dr. Walsh noted. During that time, he was sharing highways with thousands of other motorists who had no idea they were encountering a driver experiencing active hallucinations and paranoid delusions. The case led to new research into electronic monitoring systems that could detect signs of psychological distress before they resulted in dangerous driving behavior. Researchers began developing algorithms that could analyze GPS tracking data, electronic logging records, and vehicle performance metrics to identify patterns that might indicate driver psychological impairment. We're working on early warning systems that could alert fleet managers and safety officials when a driver's behavior suggests possible psychological distress, Dr. Walsh explained. The goal is to intervene before the breakdown becomes severe enough to endanger public safety. Carl's medical treatment also contributed to new understanding of how amphetamine psychosis developed and progressed in the context of professional driving. His detailed accounts of his hallucinations and paranoid thoughts provided psychiatrists with valuable information about how sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse combined to create specific types of psychological symptoms. Mr. Henderson's case is particularly valuable because he was able to provide such detailed descriptions of his hallucinatory experiences, explained Dr. Lisa Warren, the psychiatrist who supervised his treatment. Most patients with amphetamine psychosis have difficulty remembering or articulating their symptoms, but Mr. Henderson's intelligence and motivation allowed him to help us understand exactly how his perceptions became distorted. The hallucinations Carl experienced followed patterns that were consistent with other cases of stimulant-induced psychosis, but with specific elements that reflected the unique stresses and experiences of professional trucking. His paranoid delusions focused on surveillance by law enforcement, threats from other drivers, and conspiracies within the trucking industry, themes that reflected real aspects of his professional environment but distorted them into threatening fantasies. The content of drug-induced hallucinations often reflects the patient's actual life experiences and concerns, Dr. Warren noted. Mr. Henderson's paranoid thoughts about surveillance and conspiracy were based on real aspects of trucking, CB radio monitoring, GPS tracking, law enforcement inspections, but his impaired brain transformed these routine elements into threatening scenarios. Carl's recovery process also provided insights into how drivers could be helped to overcome the psychological trauma of extended psychotic episodes. His treatment involved not just medical detoxification and psychiatric medication, but also cognitive therapy designed to help him distinguish between his hallucinatory memories and actual events. One of the challenges in treating amphetamine psychosis is that patients often retain vivid memories of their hallucinatory experiences, Dr. Warren explained. Mr. Henderson could remember every detail of the surveillance vehicles and radio transmissions that had terrified him, even though he intellectually understood they had been imaginary. We had to help him process these memories without being overwhelmed by their emotional impact. The psychological impact of Carl's breakdown extended beyond his immediate medical treatment to affect his relationships with family members, former colleagues, and the broader trucking community. His experience challenged assumptions about mental health and professional competence that were deeply embedded in trucking culture. There's a stigma attached to psychological problems in the trucking industry, Carl reflected during his recovery. Drivers are supposed to be tough, independent, capable of handling anything the road throws at them. Admitting that you're having psychological problems feels like admitting that you're not cut out for the job. Carl's openness about his breakdown helped other drivers recognize and seek treatment for their own psychological problems. His case became part of educational programs designed to reduce stigma around mental health issues and encourage drivers to seek help before their problems became dangerous. Mr. Henderson's willingness to talk about his experience has probably saved lives, noted Tom Bradley, director of a driver wellness program that incorporated Carl's story into their training materials. When drivers hear about someone who went through psychological breakdown and recovered, it gives them permission to acknowledge their own problems and seek help. The long-term effects of Carl's psychotic episode continued to influence his life years after his recovery. Although his acute symptoms had resolved and he was no longer experiencing hallucinations or paranoid thoughts, he remained sensitive to stress and vulnerable to sleep disruption in ways that made it impossible for him to return to long-haul driving. The brain changes that occur during severe amphetamine psychosis can create lasting vulnerabilities, Dr. Warren explained. Mr. Henderson's recovery has been excellent, but he will always need to be careful about sleep, stress, and substance use in ways that make professional trucking inadvisable. Carl's new career in warehouse work provided stability and routine that supported his psychological recovery, but it also represented a significant reduction in income and professional status that required ongoing adjustment. The transition from being an independent business owner operating sophisticated equipment to being an hourly employee performing manual labor was psychologically challenging in its own right. I had to grieve the loss of my trucking career the same way you would grieve the death of a family member, Carl explained. That identity, being a professional driver, being my own boss, being responsible for moving important cargo across the country, was a huge part of who I was. Losing that felt like losing myself. But Carl also found meaning in his experience by helping other drivers recognize the warning signs of psychological distress and seek appropriate treatment before their problems became dangerous. He became a speaker at trucking industry conferences and safety meetings, sharing his story and encouraging drivers to prioritize their mental health alongside their physical safety. If my breakdown can help other drivers avoid going through what I experienced, then maybe it wasn't completely pointless, Carl reflected. The highway broke my mind, but it also taught me things about psychological resilience and recovery that I never would have learned otherwise. Carl's case contributed to broader discussions about the psychological costs of modern economic systems that incentivized dangerous behavior through financial pressure. His experience illustrated how individual choices about sleep, drugs, and safety were shaped by structural factors that made psychological breakdown almost inevitable for vulnerable drivers. Mr. Henderson's breakdown wasn't just a personal failure, it was a systemic failure, argued Dr. Michael Torres, an economist who studied the trucking industry's impact on driver health. The economic incentives, regulatory gaps, and cultural norms that contributed to his psychological crisis continue to affect thousands of other drivers who are struggling with similar pressures. The case also highlighted the inadequacy of current mental health resources for addressing the specific needs of commercial drivers. Traditional psychiatric services were designed for stationary patients with regular schedules, not for people whose work required constant travel and irregular hours. The trucking industry needs specialized mental health services that understand the unique stresses and requirements of commercial driving, Dr. Torres continued. General psychiatric care isn't sufficient for addressing problems that are so closely tied to the specific demands of professional transportation. Years after his breakdown, Carl remained connected to the trucking community through online forums and industry publications, following developments in driver safety and mental health research. He watched with interest as new technologies and regulations were implemented to address some of the problems that had contributed to his psychological crisis. The industry is slowly getting better at recognizing psychological problems and providing help for drivers who need it, Carl observed. But there's still a long way to go before the culture really changes and drivers feel safe admitting they're struggling mentally. Carl's story became part of the larger narrative about how America's transportation system affected the people who operated it, demonstrating that the highway was more than just a network of roads. It was a psychological environment that could nurture or destroy human mental health depending on how it was navigated. The interstate system carried more than just cargo and commerce. It carried human consciousness across vast distances and through psychological territories that could be as dangerous as any physical hazard. Carl had learned that the greatest threat to a driver's safety might not come from other vehicles or weather conditions, but from the gradual erosion of their ability to distinguish between reality and imagination. The highway had shown Carl that the human mind, like any other piece of equipment, had operational limits that couldn't be safely exceeded. When those limits were surpassed through sleep deprivation, chemical stimulation, and psychological pressure, the results could be as catastrophic as any mechanical failure, and far more difficult to predict or prevent. But the road had also taught Carl about the possibility of recovery and redemption, about the human capacity to survive psychological breakdown and rebuild life on more sustainable foundations. His experience proved that even the most severe mental health crises could be overcome with appropriate treatment social support, and the willingness to make difficult changes in lifestyle and career. Carl's 3-week cross-country descent into madness had revealed both the vulnerability and the resilience of human consciousness when subjected to the extreme conditions of modern commercial transportation. His journey across America had become a journey through the darkest territories of his own mind, where the familiar landmarks of rational thought disappeared beneath waves of paranoid delusion and hallucinatory terror. The aftermath of Carl's breakdown continued to ripple through the trucking industry as researchers, safety officials, and drivers themselves grappled with the implications of his experience. His case had exposed fundamental problems with how the transportation system treated human psychology, revealing that the same economic pressures that made the industry profitable were also making it psychologically dangerous for the people who operated it. Carl Henderson's story forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the hidden costs of our transportation system, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, a transportation psychologist who had studied Carl's case extensively. We discovered that psychological breakdown wasn't an isolated incident affecting a few troubled drivers. It was a systematic problem affecting thousands of people who were being pushed beyond human limits by economic necessity. The research sparked by Carl's case revealed disturbing statistics about mental health in the trucking industry. Studies found that long-haul drivers experienced rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse that were significantly higher than the general population, with owner-operators like Carl showing the highest levels of psychological distress. The isolation, financial pressure, and physical demands of long-haul trucking create a perfect storm for mental health problems, Dr. Kim continued. When you add sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse to that combination, psychological breakdown becomes almost inevitable for vulnerable individuals. Carl's detailed medical records and GPS tracking data became the foundation for new research into how psychological breakdown progressed over time. Researchers were able to map the relationship between his deteriorating mental state and his increasingly erratic driving behavior, creating models that could potentially predict when other drivers might be approaching similar crisis points. Mr. Henderson's case gave us unprecedented insight into the timeline of psychological breakdown, explained Dr. Janet Walsh, who led the federal research team. We could see exactly how his driving performance deteriorated as his mental state declined, providing us with potential early warning signs that could be used to identify other drivers in crisis. The GPS data showed that Carl's route deviations and speed variations had begun increasing more than 3 weeks before his final breakdown, suggesting that intervention might have been possible if appropriate monitoring systems had been in place. His electronic logging records revealed a pattern of hours of service violations that had been escalating for months, indicating that his dangerous behavior had been building toward crisis for an extended period. The data suggests that psychological breakdown in trucking doesn't happen overnight, Dr. Walsh noted. It's a gradual process that develops over weeks or months, creating multiple opportunities for intervention if we know what to look for. The case led to development of new monitoring technologies designed to detect early signs of driver psychological distress. Trucking companies began implementing systems that could analyze GPS data, electronic logging records, and vehicle performance metrics to identify patterns that might indicate mental health problems. We're developing algorithms that can recognize the subtle changes in driving behavior that precede psychological breakdown, explained Dr. Robert Martinez, a computer scientist working on driver monitoring systems. The goal is to flag drivers who might be developing problems before they become dangerous to themselves or others. But the technological solutions also raised concerns about privacy and the potential for discrimination against drivers who sought mental health treatment. Carl's experience demonstrated how financial pressure could drive people to hide psychological problems rather than risk losing their employment, and new monitoring systems needed to balance safety concerns with drivers' rights to privacy and fair treatment. There's a real tension between protecting public safety and protecting drivers' privacy, noted labor attorney Lisa Chen, who represented truckers in disputes with employers. Drivers are already subject to extensive monitoring and regulation, and adding psychological surveillance raises serious questions about workers' rights and medical confidentiality. Carl became an advocate for mental health resources that would help drivers without exposing them to employment discrimination. His experience had taught him that seeking help for psychological problems often required more courage than continuing to drive while impaired, and he worked to create systems that would support drivers rather than punish them for acknowledging their problems. The industry needs to make it safe for drivers to admit they're struggling mentally, Carl argued during his speaking engagements. Right now, most drivers would rather risk a breakdown than risk losing their jobs by seeking help. That has to change if we want to prevent more tragedies. Carl's advocacy work connected him with other drivers who had experienced psychological crises, creating an informal support network of people who understood the unique challenges of maintaining mental health in the trucking industry. These connections helped reduce the isolation that had contributed to his own breakdown and provided him with a sense of purpose in his recovery. Meeting other drivers who had gone through similar experiences was crucial for my healing, Carl reflected. It helped me understand that I wasn't weak or defective. I was someone who had been pushed beyond human limits by impossible circumstances. The support network grew into a formal organization that provided peer counseling, educational resources, and advocacy for improved mental health services in the trucking industry. Carl's story became the centerpiece of their outreach efforts, demonstrating that psychological breakdown could be survived and that recovery was possible with appropriate support. Carl's willingness to share his experience openly has broken down a lot of barriers, explained Nancy Rodriguez, a former truck driver who became a peer counselor. When drivers hear his story, they realize that psychological problems aren't a sign of weakness. They're an occupational hazard that requires the same attention as any other safety issue. The organization also worked to educate trucking companies about the economic benefits of supporting driver mental health. Carl's breakdown had cost his employer a valuable truck, lost cargo, insurance claims, and regulatory scrutiny that could have been avoided with earlier intervention. Psychological breakdown is expensive for everyone involved, noted Tom Bradley, a fleet safety manager who implemented new mental health protocols based on Carl's case. When you factor in the costs of accidents, insurance claims, and regulatory violations, investing in driver mental health becomes a clear business advantage. The educational efforts gradually began to change attitudes within the trucking industry, reducing stigma around mental health issues and encouraging drivers to seek help before their problems became dangerous. Carl's story became part of mandatory safety training for new drivers, teaching them to recognize the warning signs of psychological distress in themselves and their colleagues. We use Mr. Henderson's case to illustrate how financial pressure and sleep deprivation can combine to create dangerous psychological conditions, explained Dr. Maria Santos, who developed training materials for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Drivers learn that psychological breakdown isn't a personal failing. It's a predictable result of specific risk factors that can be managed with appropriate intervention. The training also emphasized the importance of maintaining work-life balance, getting adequate sleep, and avoiding the pharmaceutical networks that had contributed to Carl's breakdown. Drivers learned alternative strategies for managing fatigue, stress, and financial pressure that didn't involve stimulant abuse or hours of service violations. The key message is that there are safer ways to handle the pressures of trucking, Dr. Santos continued. Drivers don't have to choose between financial survival and psychological health. There are resources and strategies that can help them maintain both. Carl's case also influenced federal policy discussions about hours of service regulations, driver compensation, and safety monitoring systems. His experience demonstrated that current regulations weren't sufficient to prevent dangerous psychological conditions, and policymakers began considering additional protections for driver mental health. The Henderson case shows that we need to think beyond traditional safety regulations explained Congressman David Wilson, who chaired a subcommittee on transportation safety. Psychological breakdown is a safety issue that affects everyone on the highway, and we need policies that address the root causes rather than just the symptoms. The policy discussions focused on creating economic incentives for safe behavior rather than punishing drivers for following regulations. Carl's experience had shown how financial pressure could override safety considerations, and reformers argued that compensation systems needed to be restructured to reward compliance rather than productivity alone. We need to change the economic incentives that drive drivers to dangerous extremes, argued Dr. Michael Torres, an economist who testified before Congress about Carl's case. Right now, the system rewards dangerous behavior and punishes safe practices. That's backwards from a public safety perspective. The reforms faced resistance from industry groups that argued additional regulations would increase costs and reduce efficiency. But Carl's case provided compelling evidence that the current system was already imposing hidden costs through accidents, insurance claims, and regulatory violations that could be reduced through better mental health support. The costs of psychological breakdown are already being paid, Dr. Torres argued. They're just being paid by insurance companies, healthcare systems, and accident victims, rather than by the industry that creates the conditions causing the problems. Carl continued to follow these policy discussions with interest, understanding that systemic changes would be necessary to prevent other drivers from experiencing what he had gone through. His individual recovery was important, but addressing the industry-wide problems that had contributed to his breakdown would require collective action and institutional reform. My breakdown was personal, but the causes were systemic, Carl observed. Until we change the economic and cultural factors that push drivers beyond human limits, there will be more people like me having psychological crises while operating commercial vehicles. Years after his breakdown, Carl remained committed to mental health advocacy while building a stable life in his new career. His warehouse work provided routine and predictability that supported his psychological recovery, and his advocacy efforts gave him a sense of purpose that helped him find meaning in his traumatic experience. I lost my trucking career, but I gained an understanding of mental health that I never would have developed otherwise, Carl reflected. The breakdown was the worst experience of my life, but it also taught me things about resilience and recovery that have made me a stronger person. Carl's story continued to inspire other drivers who were struggling with similar challenges, proving that psychological breakdown could be survived and that life could be rebuilt on more sustainable foundations. His experience demonstrated that the highway, while dangerous to mental health, could also be a teacher that revealed important truths about human vulnerability and resilience. The road had broken Carl's mind, but it had also shown him the possibility of healing and transformation. His 3-week descent into paranoid psychosis had revealed the darkest aspects of modern transportation culture, but his recovery had illuminated the potential for positive change within an industry that desperately needed reform. Carl's journey across America had become more than just a cross-country freight haul. It had become a journey through the landscape of human consciousness under extreme stress, mapping territories of madness and recovery that few people ever experienced directly. His willingness to share that journey with others had made him an inadvertent pioneer in understanding how the highway affected human psychology and how those effects could be managed more safely. The interstate system carried more than cargo and commerce. It carried human minds across vast distances and through psychological territories that could be as treacherous as any physical hazard. Carl's experience had proven that the greatest threat to highway safety might not come from mechanical failures or weather conditions, but from the gradual dissolution of drivers' ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. But the road had also shown Carl that even the most severe psychological breakdown could be overcome with appropriate treatment, social support, and the courage to change course when existing paths became unsustainable. His story had become a testament to human resilience and a roadmap for others who found themselves lost in the psychological wilderness of modern commercial transportation. Carl Henderson's 3-week cross-country nightmare had revealed that America's highway system was more than just a transportation network. It was a psychological environment where the pressures of economic survival could push human consciousness to its breaking point, but where recovery and redemption remained possible for those willing to seek help and make difficult changes in their lives. The long haul. Carl Henderson had been pushing himself too hard for too long, and he knew it. 3 weeks of back-to-back cross-country runs from Seattle to Miami, averaging 18 hours of driving per day with minimal sleep, had left him operating on caffeine, determination, and the kind of pharmaceutical assistance that kept long-haul truckers moving when their bodies demanded rest. His 2019 Kenworth T6080 had become both his prison and his lifeline, carrying him across America's highways in a blur of interstate miles that were beginning to blend together into an endless stream of white lines and yellow markers. Carl was an owner-operator trying to dig himself out of a financial hole that had been growing deeper with each passing month. His truck payments were 3 months behind. His insurance premiums had doubled after a minor accident in Ohio, and his ex-wife's attorney was threatening to garnish his wages for overdue child support. The only way out was to take every load offered, drive every mile possible, and hope that the money would come in fast enough to keep his business alive and his life from completely falling apart. The current run was supposed to be his salvation, a high-paying load of electronics from Portland to Jacksonville, with a tight delivery schedule that would pay bonuses for early arrival. But somewhere between the loading dock in Oregon and the weigh station in Idaho, Carl had begun to suspect that he wasn't alone in his truck. It started with peripheral movement, shadows in his mirrors that didn't correspond to any visible vehicles on the highway. Carl would catch glimpses of motion in his side mirrors, dark shapes that seemed to be following his truck at distances that made no sense given the traffic patterns around him. When he turned to look directly, there would be nothing there. Just empty highway stretching into the distance under the endless sky of eastern Oregon's high desert. Carl tried to rationalize the phantom sightings as fatigue-induced hallucinations, the kind of visual distortions that every long-haul driver experienced during extended periods behind the wheel. After 72 hours of driving with only brief cat naps at truck stops, his brain was bound to be playing tricks on him. The human visual system wasn't designed to process the constant motion and repetitive patterns of highway driving for days at a time without adequate rest. But the shadows in his mirrors were becoming more persistent, more defined, and more obviously inconsistent with the actual traffic around his truck. Carl would see vehicles that appeared to be traveling alongside him in adjacent lanes, matching his speed perfectly but remaining just outside his direct vision. When he changed lanes to get a better view of these phantom vehicles, they would seem to change lanes with him, maintaining their relative position while staying invisible to his direct observation. The sleep deprivation was definitely affecting Carl's judgment and perception, but he couldn't afford to stop for a proper rest break. His delivery schedule allowed for minimal delays, and every hour spent sleeping was an hour that brought him closer to missing his deadline and losing the bonus money that represented the difference between financial survival and bankruptcy. Carl had been taking amphetamines to stay alert, crushing caffeine tablets to maintain energy, and relying on the kind of pharmaceutical cocktail that had sustained long-haul drivers since the early days of interstate trucking. The drugs were working. Carl felt alert, focused, and capable of maintaining his driving performance despite the accumulated fatigue of 3 weeks on the road. But they were also amplifying the paranoid thoughts that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Every car that followed him for more than a few miles became a potential threat. Every truck stop where he paused for fuel became a place where enemies might be watching him. Every phone call from his dispatcher became an opportunity for hostile forces to track his location and plan their attack. Carl knew that these thoughts were irrational, products of sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse rather than actual threats to his safety. But knowing that his paranoia was chemically induced didn't make it feel any less real or immediate. The shadows in his mirrors, the vehicles that followed him too closely, the people at truck stops who seemed to be paying too much attention to his movements, all of these perceived threats felt genuine and dangerous, even when Carl's rational mind understood that they were probably hallucinations. The breakdown of Carl's mental state accelerated as he crossed into Utah and began the long climb through the Wasatch Mountains. The combination of high altitude, reduced oxygen levels, and continued stimulant use created a perfect storm of psychological instability that made it increasingly difficult for Carl to distinguish between reality and hallucination. The shadows in his mirrors began to take on more definite shapes. Black SUVs with tinted windows, unmarked police cars, even military vehicles that seemed to be conducting some kind of surveillance operation. Carl's CB radio, which had been his constant companion throughout his career, began picking up transmissions that seemed to be specifically about him. Voices would discuss his location, his cargo, and his destination with a level of detail that suggested they were tracking his movements in real time. When Carl tried to respond to these transmissions, asking who was speaking and why they were discussing his truck, the voices would fall silent, only to resume their surveillance chatter after he'd stopped transmitting. "Eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 243, carrying electronics to Jacksonville," one voice would say with the professional tone of a law enforcement dispatcher. "Copy that. We have visual confirmation of the target vehicle," another voice would respond. "Continuing surveillance until further notice." Carl would key his microphone and demand to know who was using his truck as a surveillance target, but his transmissions would be met with silence. When he tried to contact other drivers to ask if they were hearing the same surveillance chatter, he would get responses suggesting that his radio was malfunctioning or that he was transmitting nonsense. "Driver, you're not making any sense," a veteran trucker would respond to Carl's frantic questions about the surveillance operation. "I'm not hearing any law enforcement traffic about your truck. Maybe you should pull over and get some rest." But Carl couldn't afford to rest, and he was becoming increasingly convinced that the surveillance operation was real, even if other drivers weren't hearing the same transmissions. Perhaps his radio was somehow picking up encrypted communications that weren't audible to standard CB equipment. Perhaps the surveillance team was using sophisticated technology that allowed them to target specific vehicles with their transmissions. The paranoid thoughts were becoming more elaborate and interconnected as Carl's sleep deprivation deepened. He began to suspect that his ex-wife's attorney had hired private investigators to track his movements, gathering evidence that could be used to prove he was violating hours of service regulations or operating his truck in unsafe conditions. The surveillance vehicles in his mirrors, the radio transmissions about his location, the people at truck stops who seemed to be watching him. All of these phenomena could be explained by a coordinated investigation designed to destroy his trucking career and leave him unable to pay child support. But there were other possibilities that seemed equally plausible in Carl's deteriorating mental state. Perhaps federal agents were investigating him for some unknown violation of transportation regulations. Perhaps his cargo of electronics contained something illegal that he wasn't aware of, making him an unwitting participant in a smuggling operation. Perhaps his truck's GPS tracking system had been compromised by hostile forces who were using his movements for purposes he couldn't understand. The most terrifying possibility was that Carl was losing his mind, that the accumulated stress of financial problems, sleep deprivation, and stimulant abuse had pushed him past the breaking point into a psychotic episode where his perceptions could no longer be trusted. If that was the case, then everything he was experiencing, the surveillance vehicles, the radio transmissions, the people watching him, might be elaborate hallucinations created by a brain that was no longer capable of processing reality accurately. Carl tried to test his perceptions by taking photographs of the vehicles that appeared to be following him, but the images on his phone screen showed empty highway with no other traffic visible. He tried recording the radio transmissions that discussed his movements, but when he played back the recordings, they contained only static and occasional fragments of normal trucker conversations. The evidence suggested that his experiences were indeed hallucinations, but Carl found it difficult to accept that his senses were deceiving him so completely. The psychological pressure of not knowing what was real and what was imagined became almost unbearable as Carl continued eastward through Colorado and into Kansas. He was caught between the certainty of his perceptions and the evidence that those perceptions might be false, between the immediate reality of what he was seeing and hearing and the rational understanding that sleep deprivation could create convincing hallucinations. Carl's driving began to deteriorate as his mental state continued to degrade. He found himself making sudden lane changes to avoid vehicles that other drivers couldn't see, slowing down or speeding up in response to perceived threats that existed only in his mind, and taking exits that weren't part of his planned route in an attempt to lose the surveillance vehicles that might or might not be following him. His electronic logging device recorded these erratic movements, creating a digital trail that would later be analyzed by investigators trying to understand what had happened during Carl's final cross-country run. The GPS data showed a truck that was weaving between lanes, making unexplained stops and deviating from its planned route in ways that suggested either mechanical problems or driver impairment. Carl's employer began receiving automated alerts about his unusual driving patterns, but when dispatch tried to contact him by phone and radio, Carl's responses were increasingly incoherent and paranoid. He insisted that he was being followed by multiple surveillance teams, that his radio was picking up encrypted law enforcement communications, and that he needed to change his route to avoid capture by hostile forces. "Carl, you need to pull over and get some rest," his dispatcher urged during one of their conversations. "You've been driving for 3 days straight, and you're not thinking clearly. Find a safe place to stop and we'll arrange for another driver to take over your load." But Carl was convinced that stopping would make him vulnerable to whatever forces were tracking his movements. He believed that his only safety lay in constant motion, in staying ahead of the surveillance teams that were coordinating their pursuit through radio communications he could hear, but others apparently couldn't. The idea of stopping at a truck stop or rest area, where he would be a stationary target surrounded by potential enemies, seemed like suicide. Carl's paranoid delusions became more elaborate as he crossed into Missouri and began the final leg of his journey toward Florida. He became convinced that the entire trucking industry was involved in a conspiracy against him, that truck stops were reporting his location to surveillance teams, that way stations were coordinating with law enforcement to trap him, and that other drivers were providing information about his movements to hostile forces. Every interaction with other people became a potential intelligence-gathering operation in Carl's mind. When he stopped for fuel, he was convinced that the clerk was asking too many questions about his destination and schedule. When other drivers tried to make conversation at truck stops, he was certain they were attempting to extract information about his cargo and route. When law enforcement officers conducted routine inspections, he was sure they were part of the larger surveillance operation that was tracking his every movement. The CB radio transmissions about his truck became more frequent and detailed as Carl's paranoia deepened. He heard voices discussing his mental state, his erratic driving, and plans to intercept him before he could reach his destination. The transmissions had a professional quality that suggested they were coming from legitimate law enforcement sources, but they also contained details about Carl's personal life that seemed impossible for strangers to know. "Target is showing signs of severe psychological distress," one voice would report. "Recommend intervention before he becomes a danger to other motorists." "Copy that. We're coordinating with Florida authorities to set up an intercept point near the Georgia border," another voice would respond. "Subject appears to be armed and should be considered dangerous." Carl had no idea why the surveillance team thought he was armed, since he didn't carry any weapons in his truck. But the radio transmissions were so detailed and professional that he began to wonder if he was indeed carrying something dangerous without knowing it. Perhaps his cargo of electronics contained weapons or explosives that had been hidden among the legitimate shipments. Perhaps he was being used as an unwitting courier for a terrorist organization or criminal enterprise. The possibility that he was carrying dangerous cargo without his knowledge added another layer of paranoia to Carl's deteriorating mental state. He began to imagine that his truck could be remotely detonated by hostile forces, that the electronics in his trailer contained surveillance equipment that was tracking his movements, and that he was being set up as a patsy in some larger criminal operation. Carl's sleep deprivation reached critical levels as he entered Georgia, having been awake for more than 96 hours with only brief periods of unconsciousness that couldn't be called sleep. His visual hallucinations became more vivid and persistent, with shadow vehicles in his mirrors being joined by people who appeared to be standing on overpasses, watching his truck pass below with what seemed like hostile intent. The auditory hallucinations also intensified, with Carl hearing voices outside his truck even when he was parked at fuel stops with his engine turned off. The voices seemed to be discussing plans to stop his truck, arrest him for crimes he didn't understand, and confiscate cargo that they claimed was evidence of illegal activity. Carl began to realize that he was probably experiencing a psychotic break caused by the combination of sleep deprivation, stimulant abuse, and psychological stress. But this rational understanding didn't make the hallucinations any less vivid or terrifying. Even knowing that the surveillance vehicles were probably imaginary didn't reduce the fear they generated, and even understanding that the radio transmissions might be auditory hallucinations didn't make them any less convincing. The final crisis came as Carl approached Jacksonville, less than 50 miles from his delivery destination. His truck's engine began making unusual sounds that seemed to echo the irregular rhythms of his own heartbeat, and his dashboard lights began flashing in patterns that appeared to correspond to the radio transmissions he was hearing about his surveillance. Carl became convinced that his truck was being remotely controlled by the same forces that had been tracking his movements across the country. The steering wheel seemed to be moving independently of his inputs. The accelerator responded sluggishly to his commands, and the brake pedal felt spongy in a way that suggested someone else was controlling his vehicle's speed and direction. The realization that he might not be in control of his own truck sent Carl into a panic that transcended anything he had experienced during his 3-week odyssey across America. If hostile forces could control his vehicle remotely, then he was nothing more than a passenger in a truck that was being driven toward whatever destination his enemies had chosen for him. Carl tried to regain control of his truck by pulling over at the next exit, but the vehicle seemed to resist his attempts to change course. When he tried to call for help on his cell phone, the device appeared to be jammed or controlled by outside forces. When he attempted to use his CB radio to contact other drivers, his transmissions seemed to be blocked or redirected in ways that prevented legitimate communication. The sense of complete helplessness was overwhelming for someone who had spent his entire adult life in control of powerful machinery, navigating America's highways with the confidence and skill of a professional driver. Carl had always prided himself on his ability to handle any situation that arose on the road. But now he was trapped in a vehicle that might be controlled by enemies he couldn't identify, carrying cargo that might be evidence of crimes he didn't understand, heading toward a destination where law enforcement officers were apparently waiting to arrest him. Carl's final rational thought was the recognition that he needed immediate medical attention, that his mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was a danger to himself and other motorists. But this moment of clarity was overwhelmed by the continuing hallucinations and paranoid delusions that had been building for days, leaving him unable to distinguish between reality and the products of his disintegrating mind. The Florida Highway Patrol found Carl's truck at 3:47 a.m., parked on the shoulder of Interstate 95 about 30 miles south of Jacksonville. Carl was sitting in his driver's seat, staring straight ahead through his windshield with the vacant expression of someone whose mind had completely disconnected from reality. He was responsive to verbal commands, but unable to provide coherent answers to questions about his condition or his intentions. The medical evaluation revealed severe dehydration, malnutrition, and acute amphetamine psychosis complicated by sleep deprivation that had lasted for at least 4 days. Carl's blood work showed levels of stimulants that were approaching toxic concentrations, and his neurological examination indicated temporary but significant impairment of his ability to process sensory information and distinguish between internal mental events and external reality. Mr. Henderson appears to have experienced a complete psychotic break caused by the combination of sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician who treated Carl after his breakdown. His symptoms are consistent with someone who had been hallucinating for several days while continuing to operate a commercial vehicle on interstate highways. The investigation into Carl's condition revealed the extent to which financial pressure had driven him to dangerous extremes in his pursuit of economic survival. His logbooks showed that he had been violating hours of service regulations for weeks, driving far longer than federal law allowed and taking inadequate rest breaks between runs. His pill bottles contained a variety of stimulants, some legally prescribed and others obtained through informal networks of drivers who shared pharmaceutical resources. This is unfortunately a common pattern among owner-operators who are struggling financially, explained Detective Robert Chen, who investigated Carl's case. They push themselves beyond safe limits, use drugs to stay awake longer than humanly sustainable, and eventually experience psychological breakdowns that put themselves and other motorists at serious risk. Carl's electronic logging device data provided a detailed record of his deteriorating driving performance over the 3 weeks leading up to his breakdown. The GPS tracking showed increasingly erratic movements, unexplained stops, and route deviations that suggested his decision-making ability had been compromised for days before he was finally found by law enforcement. The data shows a truck that was essentially being operated by someone who was no longer capable of rational thought, Detective Chen explained. Mr. Henderson was experiencing severe hallucinations while driving a 40-ton vehicle at highway speeds. It's miraculous that he didn't cause a fatal accident. Carl spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric facility, recovering from his amphetamine psychosis and processing the trauma of his cross-country psychological breakdown. As his mental state stabilized, he began to understand the extent to which his perceptions had been distorted by sleep deprivation and drug abuse. The surveillance vehicles were hallucinations, Carl admitted during one of his therapy sessions. The radio transmissions about my truck were auditory hallucinations caused by the amphetamines. The people who seemed to be watching me were products of paranoid thinking that developed when I stopped sleeping properly. But even with rational understanding of what had happened to him, Carl found it difficult to completely dismiss the memories of his 3-week paranoid episode. The hallucinations had been so vivid and convincing that they felt more real than his current hospital environment, and the fear they had generated continued to affect his emotional state, even after he understood their illusory nature. Recovery from this kind of psychotic episode involves more than just getting the drugs out of your system, explained Dr. Lisa Warren, the psychiatrist who supervised Carl's treatment. Mr. Henderson experienced weeks of terror and paranoia that felt completely real to him. Even though he now understands that his perceptions were distorted, the emotional impact of those experiences continues to affect him. Carl's trucking career ended with his psychological breakdown. His commercial driver's license was suspended pending medical evaluation. His truck was repossessed by the financing company, and his transportation business collapsed under the weight of unpaid bills and insurance claims. The financial problems that had driven him to dangerous extremes were now compounded by medical expenses and legal fees that made recovery even more difficult. I destroyed my life trying to save my business. Carl reflected during his final therapy session. The pressure to keep driving, to take every load, to stay awake longer than humanly possible, it all seemed necessary at the time, but it just made everything worse. Carl's case became part of ongoing research into the psychological effects of sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse among commercial drivers. His detailed medical records and the GPS tracking data from his truck provided researchers with valuable information about how financial pressure, regulatory violations, and drug abuse could combine to create dangerous psychological conditions. Mr. Henderson's experience illustrates the hidden costs of economic pressure in the trucking industry, explained Dr. Michael Torres, a researcher who studied Carl's case. When drivers feel forced to choose between financial survival and safe operating practices, some will push themselves to extremes that result in psychological breakdown and public safety risks. The case also highlighted the inadequacy of current systems for identifying and assisting drivers who were experiencing psychological distress. Carl had been in contact with his dispatcher throughout his breakdown, but his employer had no protocols for recognizing the signs of acute psychological impairment or intervening before a driver became dangerous. The trucking industry needs better systems for monitoring driver mental health and providing assistance before psychological problems become safety hazards, Dr. Torres continued. Mr. Henderson's breakdown was preventable if there had been appropriate intervention when his behavior first became erratic. Carl eventually found work in a warehouse, loading trucks rather than driving them. The sedentary work was poorly paid compared to his previous career, but it provided stability and allowed him to begin rebuilding his life without the pressure and isolation that had contributed to his breakdown. "I miss the road sometimes," Carl admitted years later, "but I also remember what it was like to lose my mind while driving a truck at 70 miles per hour. The highway can be beautiful, but it can also be a place where your worst fears and paranoid thoughts have room to grow until they completely take over your reality." Carl's story became a cautionary tale shared among drivers who were struggling with similar financial and psychological pressures. His experience demonstrated how the isolation, pressure, and pharmaceutical culture of long-haul trucking could combine to create psychological breakdowns that endangered both drivers and the public. The highway had taught Carl that the greatest dangers weren't always external threats like mechanical failures or weather conditions. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the human mind, pushed beyond its limits by financial desperation, sleep deprivation, and chemical stimulation. The road could be a place where reality and hallucination blended together until it became impossible to distinguish between actual threats and imaginary dangers. Carl's 3-week cross-country nightmare had shown him that America's highway system was more than just a transportation network. It was a psychological environment where the stresses of modern commerce could push human consciousness to its breaking point. The endless miles, the isolation, the pressure to maintain impossible schedules, and the pharmaceutical solutions that drivers used to stay alert could combine to create states of mind that were fundamentally incompatible with safe vehicle operation. But Carl's recovery had also shown him that the highway's psychological dangers could be survived and overcome. With proper medical treatment, honest acknowledgement of the problem, and a willingness to change careers, rather than continue endangering himself and others, he had managed to rebuild his life and regain his mental stability. The interstate system wasn't just 48,000 miles of asphalt connecting cities. It was a psychological landscape where the pressures of economic survival, the isolation of long-distance travel, and the pharmaceutical culture of professional driving could combine to create mental states that challenged the very nature of reality itself. And sometimes, the only way to survive the highway was to leave it behind and find a different way to make a living. Carl's experience had proven that the road could break a person's mind as easily as it could break their truck, and that the greatest enemy a driver might face wasn't mechanical failure or bad weather, but the gradual dissolution of their ability to distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. The highway carried more than just cargo and commerce. It carried the potential for psychological transformation that could destroy lives or, with proper intervention and treatment, lead to new understanding of the human mind's vulnerability and resilience.